Morning. Hi, guys. Welcome. Welcome. My name is Leo Gordon. I'm the Vice President of Career Technical Education here at the U of T. Welcome to the U of T. Usually that's what happens. Start the crowd off a little bit. Welcome to those of you that are online. First, thanks for coming. I don't know if you guys know, this week is Career Week all over the city. You got events going on with young people, educators throughout. I am so happy that WISE decided to do something here, especially over a crazy topic or the most important topic as we talk about building and sustainability. I'm sure you guys are in the trenches with this work, so you understand the grant that came down, the infrastructure grant. You understand that New York City is slated to get $12 billion in funding over the next 5 years. Actually, we're already in year one. 5.5% of that funding is due for 2023. So this topic is obviously very close to our hearts here at the city to ensure that the young people are in line for these careers within building and sustainability. I am so happy that you guys are here. I'm sure you're going to have an amazing event because WISE has never disappointed when it comes to getting groups of educators and students together. So enjoy your day. I'll be around here and there today. So if you have any questions, comments, or if we can help build whatever you got going on in your school, connect you to more teachers and students, please let me know. Thanks for coming and enjoy your conference.
Thank you very much, Leo, for your kind welcome. Thank you for hosting today's conference. Thank you for, I think, 20 years at least, a partnership between WISE and the United Federation of Teachers. And it's a partnership that we truly cherish and are very grateful for. So thank you very much indeed. I'm David Anderson, WISE's President and CEO, and welcome to our 5th annual EGE Sustainability Conference. Thank you all for coming, whether you are here in person or virtually. It's a great pleasure to see such passionate educators around this issue of sustainability. Aside from the U of T, we're very grateful to our other 2 sponsors of today's conference. You see them here, the Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation. Thank you to Alessandra Digiusto and to Con Edison. Thank you to Brian Deutsche. These 2 organizations not only are sponsors of today's conference, but they have generously provided funding, volunteerism, ideas, creativity, and so on to help us as we have developed this wonderful program called EDGE. So thank you to them as well. Would like to acknowledge our board member, Jim Avery, who's taken time out of his schedule to be here today. Thank you to the WISE staff, Samantha, Juliet, and Sheila at the desk, and our senior vice president, if she's in here, I don't think so, Christine Nguyen, who together put on what I think will be a really spectacular conference today. So I think we all agree that the world is close to a crossroads. Climate change, scarcity of resources are leading to environmental, economic, political challenges. I'm sure you all saw yesterday, I read in The Guardian that the Arctic or Antarctic sea ice is now at its lowest level ever. And that's just one of the many things we read about daily about the challenges that the Mother Earth is facing. And these challenges, I think, in turn, are leading to political challenges as well as security challenges. We're already competing for water, fish, cultivable land, and the more of these challenges that we face, the more they lead to the risk of conflict, nationalism, protectionism, and so on. We all know that there are now 6 or 7 states competing for water rights for the Colorado River, and the list goes on and on and on. And it's not a world that our young people should be inheriting. So we created Engineer Green Economics, EDGE, to help students learn about these challenges, and also, and importantly, to begin developing a sustainability mindset. Because sustainability is not just about climate, it's not just about extreme weather, it's about sustainable finance, it's about the global supply chain, food production, transportation, and today's topic, buildings and sustainable cities. And we think that by helping students develop this mindset, then we're hoping that they're going to become engaged and passionate about the sustainability challenges that we all face. And we also created EDGE to help students prepare for college and careers. Christy gave me referenced a study that I think she'll talk about later today from LinkedIn that said just in the last few years, there's been a 40% increase in demand for green skills. And so through EDGE and the WISE Institute, we're helping students develop those skills that will hopefully position them to be competitive for some of these high demand jobs in the future. And together, you wonderful educators that you are, and we really feel that it's essential that we prepare students for this road ahead. So we have an exciting program today, some great speakers. We thank our speakers for taking times out of their busy schedules to come and share their wisdom about their particular areas of expertise. And I'm very, very grateful to them indeed. And to lead off, we have our keynote speaker, Mr. Davenport. He's the managing director of New York Green Bank, and he is on the investment and portfolio management team. He's responsible for leading New York Green Bank's disadvantaged community lending activities, including financing high performance, affordable housing and beneficial building electrification that serves historically marginalized New Yorkers. He has over 30 years of experience in real estate, finance, and government. Prior to joining Green Bank, David served as Senior Vice President at Urban American Management and Management Principal of its Urban Greenfit subsidiary, where he successfully led financing and development of energy efficiency and renewable energy projects in over 6,000 units of multifamily affordable housing that have been recognized as best in class in performance and financial innovation. And prior to that, he had a career at Citibank in the community capital area. David earned his Bachelor's of Arts from Wesleyan University and a Master's in Business and Administration from Columbia Business School. So please join me in welcoming David Davenport to the podium.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be invited to the EDGE conference. I think I did this in some iteration at one point before, but it's always good to be talking about sustainability, the challenges we face, and the work that folks are doing to move us forward. It's an honor to have been asked to speak with you today. And I'm proud to say that I come from a UFT home. My mother, who just turned 93, is a UFT member. She says retired status, after being a special education coordinator in Harlem for over 30 years. I remember visiting her in that unair-conditioned office back in the 70s, and I wondered how she could be so cheerful doing such challenging work under what appeared to be dire circumstances and conditions. She told me it was, and I asked her for this speech, the determination to be of service despite circumstances. So I salute all of you for the important work that you do. While I always respected my mother's career path as an educator, she had lots of brothers and sisters that did interesting things. And I was very impressed with my Uncle Dick, who was a very successful businessman and legislator. He became one of the first African-American stockbrokers at Merrill Lynch, which recruited him into a training program when he returned home from Vietnam. And I talk about my mother, and then I talk about Uncle Dick, because Uncle Dick made a lot of money. And when I was in high school, I was very impressed with Uncle Dick, and I was like, so, you know, how do I get to, what do you do? How do you make so much? And he had this big house, and he had the downstairs where he had his records and a bar. And he said, come downstairs with me. And he brought me downstairs and took me behind the bar. And he had this chart behind the bar, along with his fraternity pictures. There was this big chart about the stock market. And he said, David, this is the, I guess it was 10 or 15 year performance of the S&P 500. And then he showed me another line. He said, this is the performance of energy stocks. So what I do is I put my customers in energy stocks. They outperform the S&P. You wake up every day, you turn on your heat, you get in your car, you're using energy, you're using oil from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. And no matter what happens in the economy, this is going to be a need. He was winning by putting his customers into oil, or before that, coal, black power. We must transition to green power for a sustainable future where we generate electricity from renewable sources, store the electricity safely, and use it to power everything from cars to buildings and everything in between. I had this little analogy just to expand on that, you know, we need to go from black power to green power. If you think of the economy, at the nation's founding, we had a slavery economy, and people were using physical labor, and that was a form of black power. And we transitioned to the industrial age, where we use coal and we use oil and we use machines to produce things. And that's another form of black power. And both of these things have now given way to a time when we need to come together and work together and harness natural resources, because the other stuff was killing us, for a green powered future. I stumbled into this work after a career in politics, school construction, finance. When the recession hit in 2008 and bankers lost their jobs, I sought out ways to repurpose my professional experience and provide leadership to my community in new ways. Barack Obama had become president and was at the time talking about green jobs being a national solution to revitalize communities and reposition our economy. Obama specifically highlighted the opportunity of green jobs and training people in communities to get jobs that are in our communities to help transition the economy. I listened and thought about ways that I could reposition my basket of skills from past jobs and experiences to something new. Over the next 12 years, I transitioned to being a banker that invested in community development, real estate, low-income housing, business investment in disadvantaged communities, and became a developer of sustainable projects in real estate and a financier of sustainable projects in real estate. Banker, energy service company, Green Bank. My college commencement speaker told us that we should not plan to have one, but multiple careers and jobs, and he was sure right. We have to be able to learn to pivot. The key to making these transitions was an education that enabled me to use past experiences of all types, learn about the green economy, and apply these skills in the new green economy. This is what we need to be able to educate kids to do. Build a toolbox of tools looking toward the reality of a globally warming future and train students to have an interest in protecting their future on this planet. To learn about renewable energy, energy science, building science, and develop the knowledge and experiences that they can put into their toolboxes. As John Dewey said, if we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, we rob them of tomorrow. Today, I've been invited to speak on the topic, what's the topic? Buildings and sustainable cities. This is a great topic to speak from here in New York State, where we have some of the most aggressive sustainability buildings programs in the country. Guided by some of the nation's most aggressive climate and clean energy initiatives, New York is on a path to achieving a zero emissions electricity sector by 2040, including 70% renewable energy generation by 2030 and economy-wide carbon neutrality by mid-century. The cornerstone of this transition is New York's unprecedented clean energy investments, including more than $35 billion in 120 large-scale renewable transmission projects across the state, $6.8 billion to reduce building emissions, $1.8 billion to scale up solar, and more than $1 billion for clean transportation initiatives, and over another $1.8 billion in green bank commitments to help finance them. These and other investments are supporting 165,000 jobs in New York's clean energy sector in 2022 alone. Partnerships are continuing to advance New York's climate action with nearly 400 registered and 100 certified climate smart communities, nearly 500 clean energy communities, and the state's largest community air monitoring initiative in 10 disadvantaged communities across the state to help target air pollution and combat climate change. To summarize, New York State is working to achieve 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030. How do we get there? Looking towards 2030, the strategy spans three broad categories: electricity, building, and transportation, things we all use and touch every day. For electricity, the plan is to achieve, as I said, 70% renewable electricity by 2030. For buildings, the plan is 2 million climate-friendly homes and 10% commercial floor space efficiently electrified by 2030. For transportation, the goal is 100% zero-emission vehicle light-duty sales by 2035 and 100% zero-emission vehicle medium and heavy-duty sales by 2045. Equity is embedded throughout this strategy with a goal of at least 35% to 40% of clean energy investments and strategies benefiting disadvantaged communities. Through my work at the New York Green Bank, I'm working to ensure that we're meeting these goals. The Green Bank is a $1 billion sustainable investment fund and a division of NYSERDA. It's a state-specialized financial entity working with the private sector to increase investments in New York's clean energy markets, creating more efficient, reliable, and sustainable energy system. We work with clients and counterparties to address and alleviate specific gaps and barriers in current clean energy capital markets through a variety of approaches and transaction structures. To date, the Green Bank has committed over $1.8 billion across 120 transactions in support of $5.6 billion in clean energy savings across the state, investments across the state, and generating a lot of money. At the New York Green Bank, I lead a team that focuses on what my box of skills trained me to do most: buildings, specifically providing financing to decarbonize buildings and fill gaps and electrify buildings in ways that the private market private market is not yet financing. Governor Hochul has been very clear that we must take bold steps on climate to protect the health and safety of our children. And New York has passed the most aggressive clean energy and climate energy agenda in the nation as outlined in the Climate Leadership and Protection Act, setting a goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 85% by 2050 and putting New York on a path to economy-wide carbon neutrality. In 2019, New York City, separate from the state, also passed its Climate Mobilization Act, regulating greenhouse gas emissions at the individual building level. And I think you'll hear more about that today. These goals are not arbitrary. They're science-based goals pointing to the level of greenhouse gas emission reduction that we need, not just in New York State, but across the country and globally to preserve and protect our planet and communities. Our climate legislation codifies important clean energy targets, which serve as the building blocks of New York's decarbonization strategy. Buildings are responsible for 1/3 of economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions in New York State, 1/3. We have more than 6 million buildings in New York, many of which were constructed before the Energy Code. 70% of our stock was built before the Energy Code, and they weren't designed to be energy efficient. We must decarbonize these buildings, get them off of fossil fuels, oil and coal, and at an unprecedented pace, not building by building, but block by block and community by community on the scale of 500 buildings a day for the next 12,000 days. This is 370,000 commercial industrial buildings by 2050, 600,000 buildings when you add multifamily. NYSERDA has mapped out a decarbonization strategy working with national experts and stakeholders in its carbon neutral buildings roadmap. Modernizing our buildings is critical to both meet our climate goals and build better, healthier homes and workplaces. The governor's executive budget, you may have heard the state of the state a few months ago, lays out a 3-part building legislative strategy that will result in buildings that protect our families and residents. First, new buildings. First, advancing zero emission new construction with no on-site fossil fuel combustion by 2025 for residential and low-rise multifamily buildings, and by 2028 for commercial and larger multifamily buildings. If you're going to build in the future, you gotta build carbon neutral. Second, for existing buildings, the proposal calls for a phase out of the sale and installation of new fossil fuel space and water heating equipment by 2030 for residential and low-rise multifamily buildings in 2030 and commercial and larger multifamily buildings. To be clear, these proposals will not ban existing gas cooking equipment and include regulatory processes to examine which exemptions are appropriate from the following categories: emergency backup power, buildings for manufacturing processes, commercial kitchens, laboratories, laundromats, hospitals, crematoriums, and critical infrastructure. Finally, to help investments and equip building owners with the data they need to reduce costs, the proposal includes a grading system for larger buildings statewide based on their energy use. New York City has started this, and you may notice building grades on your apartment buildings around New York City today. The goal of these building grades is to make available accurate, actionable data and information to help building managers make informed choices that reduce bills and emissions and let residents know where they stand. Each of these steps will require professionals trained to develop the technology, manage the technology, install the equipment, service the equipment, and on and on. How do we look at workforce development and training to get this important work done? We look at it as a priority because the challenge of today will shape the workforce of tomorrow. First and foremost, it's essential that the infrastructure created by our investments focus the economic growth and job creation power of renewable energy and building electrification to prioritize hiring in environmental justice areas and delivering benefits to disadvantaged communities. The world that Thomas Friedman called hot, flat, and crowded, the work that needs to be done to transition our economy and to achieve our goals of the Climate Act need to be done here. It has to be done here. It can't be done abroad. By adding value to things that we can touch in our communities. In a world where the internet has made jobs offshoreable, you don't need to be in the US to be a lawyer, a doctor, an accountant, or an analyst in the USA. Many of these jobs have gone overseas, but the business of decarbonizing our economy means work here. But the big work we have to do to address climate change, the world being hot, needs to be done in our communities and our homes and buildings. Right now, the Green Bank is financing energy upgrades of thousands of units of affordable housing in New York, and in many cases, residents of those buildings are being trained to do some of the work, skills they can take and apply to other buildings as a career path. We're also looking to finance local companies that can do the work, installing solar panels on roofs, insulating walls, upgrading electrical systems, converting fossil fuel heating and cooling to electric heat pumps, replacing windows, installing systems to monitor energy use, and finding workers to manage those systems. The list of opportunities in buildings alone goes on and on. These are opportunities generating renewable energy from wind and solar and using renewable energy to power everything, storing this energy in batteries and using this renewable energy when demand is high. Right now, the Green Bank is responding to a wave of proposals from companies that want to build plants to create industrial batteries and storage plants to house those batteries. These manufacturing plants need workers. The storage facility plants need workers. The companies come to us and articulate local workforce development and job creation as major goals. The challenge for the education community and our educators is to help students understand the opportunities in the clean energy transition and train them with a toolbox of skills that help them create value in this new economy. To support the clean energy economy transition, both nationally and at the state level, we need a trained, skilled workforce to design, manufacture, install, sell, maintain, operate clean energy systems properly so that we can meet our energy goals and instill confidence in customers that they're investing in new and advanced technologies. NYSERDA has committed nearly $120 million to support existing workforce development and training initiatives. And these training efforts will help train and prepare more than 40,000 New Yorkers for growing clean energy job opportunities and assist clean energy businesses in recruiting, hiring, and training workers. Additionally, NYSERDA has provided funding to support important partnerships with labor, colleges, universities, community-based organizations, nonprofits, manufacturers, trade associations, and others to ensure workers are trained through continuing education courses, certification programs, degree programs, internships, apprenticeships, and on-the-job training. In New York, we continue to ramp up the training to support investments such as offshore wind, community-scale solar projects, building electrification, transportation and energy efficiency, with targeted communities and populations central to developing the talent pipelines needed to move to clean energy. NYSERDA's workforce development efforts are supporting a career pathway supporting career pathway programs that provide education, training, and services to help place new workers into clean energy occupations like high efficiency heating, ventilation, air conditioning, building electrification, all these things. NYSERDA has a clearinghouse for many training and educational programs for teachers. And you can access these resources. I don't have a slide, I can't point you to it, but you go to the NYSERDA website, and maybe I give to Christy a link where you can go for some of this stuff that you can access to begin developing curriculum plans today. On NYSERDA's website, you can find a link to a long list of clean energy, educational, and professional development opportunities. These tracks provide funding to applicants for services that will engage students, faculty, staff, and the surrounding communities in clean energy educational opportunities. Schools can utilize these tools or apply to receive funding for new or customized efforts of their design. NYSERDA also offers paid internships and fellowship programs that can help jumpstart a future in the clean energy field. Clean energy positions are in high demand, and the market will only continue to expand as New York transitions away from fossil fuels. Careers in clean energy also typically offer above average salaries, healthcare, and other great benefits. Whether a student's strengths are in community organizing, construction, engineering, marketing, or sales, NYSERDA has pathways to help students get their foot in the door in one of New York's many clean energy businesses. NYSERDA offers paid internships to 16 to 24-year-olds who are enrolled in or have completed comprehensive work preparedness programs, such as those offered by boards of cooperative education, technical high schools, Conservation Corps, Youth Build, AmeriCorps, and other organizations. And NYSERDA offers paid internships for college students and provides funding to clean energy companies to hire the students. All you have to do is go to our website, and I don't have a slide, I'll give Christy a link for it. All you have to do is go to the website for more information on a number of programs: New York State Clean Energy internships, Climate Justice Fellowships, Clean Energy Career Maps, a directory of free online clean energy education, clean energy training, and participating clean energy employers. The overwhelming challenge of confronting climate change can be daunting, but we know that if we start now, we can confront the pivotal issue of our time. As my mother said, we must have the determination to be of service despite the circumstances. In New York State, we have a nation-leading plan and strategy to address climate change with the Climate Act, and we have the determination and will and means to achieve our goal. I thank you for your invitation today to share what we're doing in New York State and to hopefully inspire you to join us in this effort as we educate our students for the challenges and opportunities ahead. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions? Yes. Aren't getting away that easily.
I actually have two questions. I teach science. Last week I was teaching climate change. I teach at the Manhattan 9-day school. All our students work almost full time, and they have very low paying jobs. I would love to, that's just, first of all, just pitch. I would love to connect with someone to find them better jobs in this because they are interested in it. Their number one question is, what is that clock in Union Square, a block away from our school, that says in 7 years it's over? And I don't know what organization, it's a clock and it's ticking. And in 7 years, something's going to happen to us. And my students are concerned about it. The other question I have is, have you talked to DOE about what they're going to do about their buildings? Is anyone coordinating with them about how they're going to make their buildings greenhouse gas? Okay. That's the state question.
Here are my responses. The website can direct you towards programs and internship opportunities where they can look at companies that are hiring, different types of opportunities, and training certifications. Sorry, I don't have the slide. I'm not sure what that clock is counting down now. There was once one that counted down until till the year 2000, till till the national debt blew up. My guess, and this is just a guess, if it has something to do with climate, it is, what is it that we're measuring? The degrees, the percentage degree in Fahrenheit that we have to cap before the Earth's temperature it gets so warm and climate emissions are irreversible. That's my guess, but I don't know. I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. And we're the state, so we don't work directly with, you said BOE? Oh, DOE. Yeah, yeah. So you're talking about the Federal Department of Education? Yeah, okay, the New York City BOE. So yeah, New York City has, believe it or not, a decarbonization czar under DCAS. I know that because the guy just came and joined NYSERDA, just joined NYSERDA. But there is a role within the administration looking at decarbonizing all of the city's buildings in a structured and strategic way, including buildings. And earlier in my career, I worked at the School Construction Authority. I know this is a priority there as well.
Thanks, David. I appreciate the time that you gave to go through all that information. There was one stat that you gave, which was pretty astounding to me, which was that you said that we need to go at a pace of 500 buildings per day to go into meeting some of these goals. That goes from just getting off of the fossil fuels into green technology, or also retrofitting buildings. And the second question I have is, how is the Green Bank funded, and how do we invest if we wanted to invest in something?
These are my responses. Yeah, that's a pretty astounding number, the rate and clip of the building decarbonization in the plan. I have to confess, I didn't write the plan. That's one of NYSERDA's talking points, so I couldn't tell you exactly. I would imagine we're talking about, the staged rate of getting buildings off of all. There are a couple of steps. There's decarbonization, and you heard me use that term a lot, and that's just doing things to reduce carbon emissions from buildings, and that can be done all at once, or that can be done on a phased basis. It's making the building more airtight. You decarbonize a building by reducing its energy intensity. You make the thing airtight, and you reduce heating and cooling. And then the heating and cooling is done from renewable sources. And eventually, we're also going to get to the point where we're building new buildings. I think in New York City, beginning in 2035, you won't be able to build anything that has fossil fuel on it. So it's a mixture. It's a mixture of those things. And you had a second question?
Just how's the Green Bank funded, and if you wanted to
The Green Bank was funded by the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission regulates all utilities in New York State, your cable, your phone, your utilities, and as a subscriber of those services, you pay something called the System Benefit Charge, which is something you probably don't notice. It's one of those many little charges on the bill that you don't look at anymore. And that money is used to fund programs. 10 years ago, it was tapped to provide the Green Bank with $1 billion of ratepayer capital to be a revolving loan fund. So the Green Bank, we're celebrating our 10th year. And in the early years, they brought in a bunch of renewable energy bankers, project finance guys, and most of the work that they did was focused on renewable energy projects, wind, hydro, solar, stuff that could deliver reliable, predictable cash flows and was fairly low risk, but the private market wasn't doing. And in so doing, they were able to become self-sustaining within 5 years. Buildings have been something that we've started to do more of over the past 4 years. And as we talk more about decarbonization, the amount that goes into renewable will shift, I think, towards like building electrification and decarbonization.
There's one more question.
Thank you. How is resiliency integrated into the three-pronged approach that you summarized, or how does that fit on the agenda?
Beautiful question. Resiliency is distinguished from electrification and decarbonization, and reducing energy intensity focuses on making the building able to withstand climate emergencies and floods. And yeah, so you know, if you apply to the Green Bank for funding, we have the Climate Act has specific targets, whether it's the production of renewable energy, whether it's decarbonization, whether it's electrification, whether it's resiliency. You need to check as many of those boxes as possible, and that's how we score. That's how we score what we fund. Resiliency is a critical component of our strategy. We don't determine what walks in the door. So when they come in the door and we're in dialogue, we look for resiliency to be part of the strategy. Usually it is if you're building new. If you're building new, the real challenge is with existing buildings.
Thank you very much.
All right, thanks, guys.
Good morning. I'm Alessandra Digiusto. I'm head of Deutsche Bank Americas Foundation and CSR Americas, and I'm excited to be here today. I'm a public school mom. My son just went to college and he went K through 12 at West End Secondary, which did a lot of environmental program across its disciplines. So it's great to be here today. I'm also very excited to be that we're supporting the 5th annual EDGE conference. Deutsche Bank has been a supporter of WISE for many years, since the late 1990s through funding and volunteerism. We've been happy to contribute to WISE's hard work and dedication and their outreach in the schools. We've been actually supporting their education programs for both students and teachers. In 2019, we did a hackathon where we had over 100 volunteers from the bank help create a mobile app for WISE for financial literacy. And we are very pleased that it's been a success, and we're working on the next phase of it right now. We're proud of their innovative and pioneering work, and I'm delighted to be here today as a sponsor of the EDGE conference. I wanted to just briefly review some of Deutsche Bank's broader sustainability initiatives and goals. I sit in the CSR side, which is kind of the S of ESG, but along with the D&I, which is in the S. But now in the last year, we've rolled out some environmental programming, but the different businesses have very strong goals. And a lot of this started in Europe, where they're much further along in this type of thinking. But for governments, banks, and corporates, one of the biggest challenges of our times is shifting the global economy towards sustainability and net zero. And like many banks, we have established sustainability targets in our businesses. Overall, we aim for 500 billion euros in cumulative ESG financing and investment volumes from early 2020 to 2025. And I know that last year we outperformed as trying to, meet that goal. On the business line front, our corporate bank is working very closely on supply chain financing solutions to support 5 billion in sustainability linked working capital finance commitments. Our investment bank has a goal of 3 billion euro in ESG financing in developing economies and working with emerging markets by 2025. And our private bank in Germany is working on a goal of 7 to 10 billion in financing for energy efficient homes. I know that the US Wealth Management Group is very actively right now launching a philanthropic investment fund for oceans and ocean protection. And at least 90% of our high emitting clients in the most carbon intensive sectors are engaging in new corporate lending transactions to have a net zero commitment by 2026. So these are ambitious goals for the bank. And one of the things that Deutsche Bank needs now is a trained workforce. And I think you all play such a critical role in training the next generation. On a local level, our foundation is America's Foundation, and the majority of our grant making is in New York City. And we launched this environmental campaign called How We Live. And it's focused on to protect, restore, and provide education about the environment. And How We Live is inspired by the conviction that when we act together, results are more powerful. So the future of urban life and the economic ecosystem here is really dependent on environmental sustainability, especially in the face of climate change. So we have partnered with many amazing nonprofit organizations that are restoring urban watersheds, that are protecting oyster reefs, for developing sustainable food systems and conserving resources so that all communities can thrive. One of the interesting things is when we knew we were going to launch this program, we went to some of our existing nonprofits that weren't traditional science or STEM nonprofits. And we really asked what they were doing in sustainability and said that there was funding available. So to really get them all to think out of the box about how they can cross over disciplines. For many years, we've known that artists has been very ahead of this. Years ago, we had an exhibit at our headquarters on artists that actually produced work in sustainability. I want to just go through very quickly some of the projects that we've uncovered. And I know Billion Oyster Project, I don't know if any of you have had them in your school. They're incredible. And we're supporting the successful restoration of New York's reefs and the local biodiversity, but their expeditionary learning program and curriculum around that is incredibly strong. And it works well with elementary school students, but also through high school. We're also supporting a new satellite field station, working with the Queens Museum and the Guardians of Flushing Bay to integrate that into their education programming for students. The field station is going to be committed to the water quality now and for the future, and looking at both climate justice and watershed stewardship and what local communities can do to protect those water areas. Jobs First New York City, we're working on building a green economy network, trying to map future skills to the jobs of the future. In Harlem, we're funding Brotherhood Sister Soul, that's developed a very strong program connecting social and environmental justice, where youth create greenhouses and gardens, but also they manage a farmer's market where they're growing a lot of the fruits and vegetables and managing it as a business themselves. And they're also using innovative aquaponic and hydroponic technology and learning about how to do sustainable urban agriculture. We're also doing up in the Bronx, worked with the Edible Academy at the Brooklyn Botanical Gardens, Grow New York City, that many of you know they fund community and school gardens. And our employees have done work on trying to decide who gets those applications. And in New York City parks, we're working closely with the Pollinator Place Gardens. So those are just a small sampling of some of the programs we're doing. I know that one of the questions was about curriculum and teacher training. We've been also meeting with the Office of Sustainability in the DOE, and they're working on developing curriculum and intensive training. And then also both on the national, there's a move to look at rolling out curriculum and looking at both the New York City curriculum, but also federal curriculum and what we can do to make changes. And I'd say that, 3 years ago, when we were trying to source nonprofits to fund, there was such a gap. And now you even have things like in Governor's Island, a new climate museum that's going to be forming, and Climate Center working with an academic partner to be announced soon. So there are a lot of opportunities, and I think it's growing quickly, and everyone's realizing how important it is to get this into the schools and to train teachers. So for the next generation really has an understanding. And I think one of the things, that a lot of students don't seem to understand, I know speaking for my son, is, it's not just the tree huggers in the environment. The environmental work is really, throughout all the different areas that you could potentially study in curriculum. And in the future, when you go to college, and how important it is, and even for non-college aspiring students. So it's very important, I think, that students understand the relevance of this. We know, however, that climate change and sustainability challenges cannot be solved without working closely with the community. And that's why we want to support teachers and schools in your tremendous effort to bring this knowledge into the classroom and to better prepare our youth for a sustainable future. For me to be here among all of you in the public school educators and distinguished speakers today, and volunteers who dedicated to supporting this area of education is very wonderful. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Professor Harriet Harris. Dr. Professor Harriet Harris is a visiting professor and principal investigator of the Erasmus Sector Skills Alliance School of Architecture in the Royal College of Art. She actually previously was more local with us and was a former dean of the Pratt School of Architecture in Brooklyn, and is also an award-winning educator and qualified architect. Her teaching, research, and writing focus on pioneering pedagogic models for design education and exploring the intersectional edge of social justice and the climate crisis theories and practices. Dr. Harris's advocacy for diversity and inclusion within design education. Okay, I got here a little late. I'm like, oh, is she not here? So for diversity and inclusion with the design and education was further recognized by Design magazine, which identified Dean Harris as one of the top 10 champions for women in architecture and design in 2019. Her publication won the annual Bates Prize for Architectural Media. Her recent and forthcoming publications include Working at the Intersection, the Architecture of the Post-Anthropocene, 100 Women Architects, Architecture's Afterlife, and the Routledge Companion to Architectural Pedagogies of the Global South. Combined, the texts extrapolate upon her growing expertise in archival activism, climate crisis curriculum, and diversity and equity. So welcome, Dr. Harris.
So just okay. Right, I'll be standing slightly spiffy because I like to read from my slides a bit. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor, actually. So I'm going to be as quick as I can for lots of information. I know you all know what that feels like when you're looking at curriculum for schools. And I've got a bit of a provocative title. Let's hope it is, because it should be. And I will make copies of my presentation available. So if you don't worry too much about taking pictures now, you can if you like. It's very flattering, but maybe wait till we decide whether it's worth taking pictures of first. So button that way, maybe that way. Okay, and just to start, of course, where we are right now is on Lenape land. Lenape are the first peoples of New York, particularly Brooklyn and Manhattan. So it's just an acknowledgement that we're here as their guests, uninvited as we may be, and just to recognize that and have a moment for that. So I've been thinking a lot, always dangerous, isn't it, thought, especially when you're a teacher. But I've been looking a lot at pedagogy in my doctorate and in the 13 books now, approaching 15 books I've been involved in or written. And I was starting to wander off into the exquisite forest of indigeneity theory and First Peoples narratives. And one of them, if you like, principal rules of play within this discourse is to remember that everything is just a story. We think we know what disciplines are, and we think we know what epistemologies are, but they're somebody else's invention. They're not ours. So hold that thought. So there's 3 stories here, okay? And like I said, I'll share copies of this later with you. The first is a bit about school, and it's a bit about Pratt. And I know that was a rather overwhelming biography of me. And the other side of the biography is I'm obsessed with cats. I'm dyslexic and dyspraxic and on the spectrum. So that makes evenings entertainments in our household always a delight, I suppose. Unless, of course, you want to eat on time. But it is a way of looking at the world, isn't it? And obviously I'm British, so I'm coming from, one of the colonial superpowers to come and impart knowledge potentially to an American audience, which in some ways is a kind of reenactment of history, in ways a bit problematic, so bear with me. So this picture actually is where Pratt now stands. So it was back then, of course, if you like, defined, categorized by architects and well-meaning planners as a slum. What it was not defined as was a diverse community that had about 15 or 16 different languages spoken with any square hectare. So it's interesting looking at the taxonomies within the built environment and whose agenda they serve. This is Charles Pratt. He was a child of 11, and he basically knew how to read and write just about before he went to work. And his job, in fact, his first job was, if you like, managing the accounts for whale oil, because back then, prior to 1850 in America, whale oil was the oil that lit your kerosene, well, you lit your lamps and so on, and actually in some cases allowed you to heat food. And America was great at like killing whales and making whales into useful things like lighting indoors. So, interior design is implicated kind of thing. And along came Charles, and he wasn't, if you like, single-handedly responsible for, if you like, the revolution that was oil extraction, which obviously translated into kerosene. But this is what he was doing. So this is, of course, where once an American forest stood. And I've read a lot of stuff about American forest. You have got lots of trees, I'm sure you've noticed. But in a way, that's interesting because there's been rather a lot that have been cut down in the last couple of 100 years. And more trees have been cut down in America since the 1960s ecological movement. So I love the fact we get conscious about it and we kill even more, like really, really quickly, as if we're going to run out of time. So he created Astral Works, no irony, I don't think, meant on his part, by giving an oil production factory an astrological name. So this was in Bushwick. And obviously it was, as you probably know, vast empire. He was in fact the wealthiest Brooklynite for several decades. And in all of this, of course, he actually had somewhere in the kind of, the questionable ethics of oil production, tried to do good things with bad money. And we all know about that. So one of the good things he did was to create apartments that had, in fact, inside of them, kindergartens and libraries. And so the really interesting thing is that the Education Institute kind of came about from wanting to provide really outstanding worker housing. And so the very first course at Pratt, and by the way, Pratt at the time was the only school, only kind of college degree program you could go to, or only college that accepted everybody. There wasn't any embargoes if you were, depending on your race or your gender. It's the only place. So obviously arts and crafts, I won't go into that too much, a little bit of a European nod to the superpowers of culture, etc. But the dark side of all this, of course, is that vast amounts of oil seeped into the East River, Newtown Creek especially. And the consequence of that is that still today, even now, people are still dying as a direct consequence of that pollution. It's gone. I'm sorry, the slides chopped off at the bottom. I really apologize, but you'll get a copy later. But yeah, the local aquifer, which sounds a bit like that thing you make smoothies with in the morning, but far more serious is the fact that it absorbs all of that waste and holds it and releases it over time and creates carcinogens that are still affecting New York's residents. So nice picture of a whale. Happy end to the whale, not so much for us, but there's still a school story here. And that's me wandering in and deciding that I wanted the school to have a little bit of an agenda about what it should do. So, you know, all schools have to have agenda. You've got your institute's values, you've got NYSERDA's values. And if you have professional degrees, you have the prescription that those things hold and, if you like, encumber you with. But I needed a kind of meta thesis for a school, really. And it wasn't about just making architects. I wasn't running a roasting chicken factory where it's an oven ready Frederica or Freddie that I needed to pump out into the universe of architectural production. What I wanted was produce a school that would allow graduates to actually lead the future that we failed to create for them. And I think there's something really important to say about the intersection of talking about sustainability or climate crisis or climate change, depending on whether you like your eggs soft-boiled, hard-boiled, I don't know. The point is it cannot happen without social justice. So that was the agenda for the school. And what did I do? I did lots of things in 3 years before I decided that I wanted to carry on writing a bit more and not worrying about how many toilet papers we had left in the staff bathroom. And I decided to do a few nice things. One of them was to realize that actually students haven't really got much time to figure out what they're going to do and actually take over from us because we've been a bit rubbish. We might want to give them a bit more power now in the hope that it can change our futures sooner. So I created a student deanship. This would allow the students to get the memory muscle of academic leadership, because I'm not interested in just making them all run off and become architects. Long story about why, maybe over a drink in the pub later, but basically this was what we did, and it meant I had a revolving door with the students and what their needs were. It also, I think, built in them the memory muscle for academic leadership in future. I also gave them a massive slice of the school's lecture series budget and said, off you go. You tell us who you want to hear from. And in fact, we still had our school budget, or the, if you like, the professorially led lecture series. What was interesting is that, especially in the pandemic, more people from around the world were coming to listen to the students' choice of speakers than they were the faculty's. So it's very interesting seeing that shift. And also just bumping out prizes, you know, not just ones which were me scrabbling around in the bottom of the biscuit tin looking for $5, but ones where we got partnerships with external agencies like newspapers. So we have a great partnership that remains in place, which is, again, not just about the production of architecture, but who gets to speak about it, who gets to decide what is worthy, what is newsworthy. All of these things are interrelated. So 3 students a year are chosen as fellows, and they're given more money than I've ever got paid for doing an article. And they get to write these beautiful articles, and they really do. And they're really much better than mine, actually, to be fair. So that's another thing, trying to do, influence the way that these things are received and how they're described. But if you like, steering the student prizes towards, again, this emphasis on sustainability, a term we will have issues with later, you know, early warning. And then the other thing was to get lovely sponsorship from an organization called IDZ to set up an incubator that principally had to be, the selection criteria was principally that the students had to propose climate, if you like, climate crisis responsive startup businesses. It meant we get to keep the graduates for an extra year, give them their own little space without the overheads that normal startups would have. And of course, they have this kind of connectivity then back to the students and the remaining student body as inspirers and leaders. And also partnerships. What was important to us is to sort of think about the distributed classroom, you know, this idea, of course, and you're all familiar with it, of getting people out of the building every now and again. And, you know, it's called education institution for a reason, right? And so we created lots of partnerships, one with Governor's Island, which was alluded to earlier. And then the other one was, well, several, in fact, one with Queen's Museum. There's 168 partnerships in the School of Architecture now with external parties. And these are just some of the interesting ones. And then, of course, to think about new programs. And I think it's often the case that, you know, things like landscape architecture kind of marginalized. It's a big part of architecture. And to be able to create a new program with NYSERDA through a pandemic, apart from being lots of fun and lots of stress, meant that we could really, if you like, orient the curriculum towards a sort of carbon neutral city, food autonomous city agenda. So I'm very embedded in not imagining landscape to be this pastoral idyll where there's lots of people wearing period costumes frolicking around and having, you know, anxious relationships with neighbors on horseback, but actually something more centered in addressing food poverty in the city, because about 10% of New York's population have food insecurity, and that is an education responsibility. And then, of course, lots of opportunities to speak publicly, internationally, and widen the community of discourse around all these issues. And then for faculty, So don't get terribly jealous, to set up prizes, to recognize their work, but to also give them spaces to start brainstorming. So they have this forum that isn't just about enriching teaching, but they can become writers and scholars and researchers and have the resources to do that. And then, of course, we didn't have any money, right? Everyone will say, neither did we. So waiting for that moment. But, what we imagined was, and this comes back to David's first speaker's point, was, you have to look at the existing building stock. 80% of people working in the construction industry within the next 5 years will be doing conversions, not new build. We are still teaching a curriculum centered on new build. So it's really about looking at what you can do to the environment around you. What could we do to adapt these spaces? And so we ran little competitions with the students, reimagining what the building could look like and transform into to become carbon neutral. And these are some of the ideas they came up with. Reminder, of course, of what Emma Perez said, because we're about to go into the next story. So that was school. And this one's scholarship. I don't like this word. It's a long story, but I'm going to talk a bit about my books, which is how not to write books, really, if I was honest. All of them are naughty, and I'll explain why. So they're normally written because I'm dissatisfied with the books I'm reading. I think they're not telling me what I need to hear. So if I write the book I want to read, then I've got an excuse for looking up to find out where that information is. And if it doesn't exist, I can invent it. So every book is a frustration with the inadequacies of architecture's canon or the local library, one or the other. And it's funny because there's Radical Pedagogies, if you don't know about it, was a big project run by Beatrice Calomina at Harvard as a group PhD looking specifically at architecture education, but there's some gems in there for everybody. But my confrontation with it was that I didn't like the idea of a bunch of American academics at Harvard telling me what British architectural education was. So we did a very British specific book, and it wasn't British people specifically, it was anyone teaching in the UK looking at these different and diverse models of education as a kind of protest against not having a voice in somebody else's categorization of what we were doing. And this is one example, getting a bunch of students to drive around England on a bus. This is 1960s, I love the fact we always think radical is all about the future when it's not really. But I love the idea, of course, that it's moving beyond this notion of an institution and hijacking in some ways parasitically a bus to connect students to the community. But it also comes back to, what is a pedagogue? First of all, in case you weren't aware, the actual term comes from ancient Greece, and it means leader of the young, and it was a job exclusively given to slaves. And I'm sure some of you right now are thinking, well, yeah, it sounds familiar, actually. Well, the hours I've got this week are somewhat excruciating, but that's the interesting thing, because it's children too. Andragogy is adult learning, and pedagogy is children. But radical just means root. So when we sort of think, actually, oh, radical means this new idea we haven't come up with, this invention, because innovation, by the way, isn't it? Not invention. As you know, innovation is more of an adaptation or an advancement of an existing idea. Invention is doing something completely from scratch. It's not an invention. It's actually going back to a core set of values. And we seem to struggle to have consensus over what core anything is. And certainly when it comes to what sustainable approaches are necessary. But anyway, moving on to the next book, which was a little bit more of an, and this is where the alchemy, this kind of like here are my books, show and tell, is about blending some of these ideas into these, what I'm going to be saying. This one was really recognizing actually that having looked at a lot of books about the fact that architecture is terribly sexist, and there's lots of reasons why that's bad. It's also very racist as well. There's also lots of reasons why that's bad. But it's largely to do with you can't design effectively for diverse communities if your community as a profession is not diverse. And I think what was interesting about doing this book is all the books I'd read were always women writing about women's terrible situation. So this book for me was important because it was men and women recognizing that sexism condemns both genders. And of course, there are more than two genders. But that this was the point really, that we're not going to solve this in isolation. We carry on writing feminist books where it's a bunch of, other women, but this felt important to kind of have a shared conversation and also understand how damaging sexism was to men going on site and expected to kind of throw their weight around and boss everybody and work these ridiculous long hours and never see their kids, because that was, what being a champion architect's all about. So lots of toxic expectations. And it might explain why, there's so few women architects in the UK, the US and Europe, although Europe's a lot better. In fact, the worst place to be an architect in the world is Japan. It's really, really quite terrible statistics over there. In fact, I think that the most exciting place to be an architect right now. It's probably America, only because everything's about to get very interesting here in the next election, and there's going to be a lot of reconstruction, but we won't go into detail on that one. So as I mentioned before, this is my thesis. It's what underpins my scholarship. In this book, which was rather nice to write, it was looking at everybody who leaves architecture. So as I stand here, I'm not encouraging anyone to come into architecture. In fact, I like to think of it as something, well, first of all, it was invented about 250 years ago by a load of white rich guys in England who had loads of money, largely from slavery, had nothing better to do, and thought they might steal architecture from the Freemasons and make it a special little boys' club so they could all be A-seats together in the Enlightenment period, and then make entrance into this mystical boy, kind of, I think it was like a private den in the garden, extremely strange and obtuse, so that no one could really get in unless they're one of the gang. And that's kind of architecture's foundations, really, as a discipline. So this book was a kind of a rehabilitation project because it spoke to all the people who'd left and were doing much more interesting things, the scenographers, the politicians, the game designers, the artists. And that's what really this is. It's recognizing that any professional degree is not a prison sentence. It might think it is because the word prescription gets thrown around, but it's not. 45% of graduates from US colleges will never, ever never work in a discipline in any way related to their college degree subject, 45%. So we're all worrying, I think, a bit too much about which college degree. It doesn't matter, actually, just go and enjoy yourself. And so I did a study, which I'm concluding right now. The report's about to come out in the white paper, which is looking at whether this was something that happened across Europe. It's actually similar statistics to the US. It was €500,000, so a lot of pressure to say nice things about Europe in general. But Europe's interesting, contrasts are quite acute. America's always, slightly more precarious in how it hires people, but there's a lot of insights, which I won't reveal now because the report's coming out in about 3 weeks. But it was just understanding this kind of migration of skills, this idea of all these things we talk about students needing, the millions of attributes that you as educators have, like Atlas, carry on your shoulders, behaviors, skills, transversalisms, it gets exhausting, doesn't it? And all of that, when actually what really happens is they say, I don't really want to do this professional career and go to something else anyway. But yeah, that's a bit more about the study. And so now to have some fun with the term sustainability. So I'm always interested in etymologies because obviously being dyslexic, I'm always thinking, I wonder what that really meant, and who said it, because I'm sure they meant something else. And so first of all, just to sustain something is to be able to bear it. It also has a sort of defensiveness to the term. And I think, well, it's interesting, we talk about sustainability, we invite young people to be sustainable. What we're saying is we've made an absolute shambles of the planet, try to hold it where it is, not to actually think about doing something to undesign our errors or undesign what they've inherited. So I think there's an embedded complacency in the term, but I think it could be a fun exercise with students to ask them to think about it. Because we're not very able, actually, as it turns out, to sustain what we have now. We are past a tipping point, and it's much more focused on how do we accept the decline that we are facing, but accept it well. And that really comes down to the lack of anthropocentrism. In other words, not thinking of ourselves as a preeminent species for 5 minutes, and we might have actually some time to think about other things we can learn from. So, as I said, every book is a kind of protest about not finding the book I want to read. This one I put together now 2 years ago, I think, or a year ago. And this involved a lot of people who were just absent from discourse on ecological theory and architectural environmentalism in general. So inviting people like Walter Hood, who's one of the preeminent Black landscape architects in the US, and making sure that it wasn't just a bunch of old white blokes. And I love old white guys, by the way, there's plenty of room at the table, but it just gets a bit boring when, it's like the Mr. Bob Dobalina in every single lecture about the environment. And it's nice to mix it up sometimes. So that's what this book was about. Lots of long words for reading later about what we were trying to do, or not so long words. But it started to raise a question about architecture pedagogy's complicity in creating a lot of these ecological or unsustainable problems. So let's remind ourselves here where we are. As I said before, this is what sustainability means. We're actually 5 degrees away from mass extinction, just to kind of put it in perspective. Usually about 74%, 92% of all species are wiped out in every other extinction prior to this one that's coming up. Chances of us ever making it into the surviving percentile, pretty low. And by the way, good luck millionaires on the moon without your millions of underpaid workers keeping you up there. You're going to be the first to go. So, then the architecture project, is it really about, creating bunkers for the rich in deserts, or is it actually about designing the architectures of survival species that are likely to prevail, which is where the mathematicians and the ecologists and the artists can get together and agree on something. See, disciplines not necessary. Also, construction is one of the main users of reforest timber, as I'm sure you know. Even now we still are. There are 16 million slaves working in the world for our stuff. Still, slavery is not over. Actually, by the way, 7% of the US construction industry is slaves, just to cheer yourself up thinking about that. And of course, as if you haven't got enough in storage, whatever it is, £500,000 a year in New York to store a cat vet basket. We've got new things coming on, new closet space needed, because every year in this world, we invent 30,000 new, probably useless products or adaptations. And I think at least 10,000 of those are Apple changing the plug-in and recharging cables every 5 minutes. And of course, textiles. So this isn't just about architecture, it's about fashion, it's about interiors. These fibers, they are fossil fuel derived, they have toxicities. We inhale them all the time, don't we forget about that. Everything in this room right now, we're inhaling particular matter from this room. Now that we figured out what atoms are, there's not much you can do with a mask, in fact. And of course, global construction waste. As we sit here thinking, oh gosh, we're all doing lots of things about it. We're not, just getting more and more acute. And this statistic was 2 years old. And this hasn't slowed either. It's possibly getting worse. There was a slight delay in the pandemic and then that shifted. And of course, while we were all on Zoom feeling righteous because we weren't taking flights or holidays or going to conferences to speak, there we were just making a substantive contribution to CO2 through another means. So there's nowhere to hide, in any of this. No one is innocent. And then, of course, all that e-waste, those obsolete cables, all that kind of hardware, all the things we think we need as educators and students think they need as learners. So much of it is not relevant. And having just spent some time with the Shuar tribe, where I had a talking stick for an entire week, I can tell you, you don't need much in the way of props to be able to have an educational experience. And then, of course, the delightful fact that there's not many animals out there to be designing for if we can get over our anthropocentric conceits in architecture, because we've annihilated most of them. And those that are left are largely suffering terribly in abattoirs and other food production units. And I'm not suddenly going to say, right, everybody, off you go, become vegans. It'd be nice if you did. But main problem is, though, that the lack of humanity in that production has reached such a peak. There are questions, I think, to be asked about how to grow things resourcefully, how to care for things, even if we want to eat them at the end. But I always think if you can chase it down a street in Brooklyn, stab it and kill it in a public place, you should eat that thing. If you can't, maybe just try vegetarianism. So this is really about thinking about, if you like, the binarity of architecture. We talk about designing inclusively. We don't design inclusively. I mean, we don't design anything inclusively. We think inclusion means going into a room full of people in a community with a bunch of Post-its and 3 designs that have already been made and say, pick one. That's not consultation, that's not co-design. But beyond that, we're still building exclusively for one species. One species. There is such a problem with that image. I mean, I know that rats have a different agenda in New York, bless them. And I kind of like that, they're sort of just waving to me going, I'm reading your books, I know what's going down. But there's something about the fact that we can't inherent within our treatment of ourselves, and we are, by the way, the only species that eats its young or imprisons them or brutalizes them or is homophobic or even racist, the only species that treats ourselves in such a destructive way, which is kind of madness. So in a way, 6 mass extinction, I'll be there, suntan oil on, reading a book on the beach, thinking, phew, then the animals can figure everything out. And maybe when we come back, once we've crawled out of the swamp again and gone through all of that, hanging around dressed up as monkeys or whatever, then we'll do a better job next time. But all of these things are not unrelated to how we treat every species. The internal discrimination is externalized. The two are not separable. So that book I mentioned, and I can send the intro, etc. if you're interested. Don't feel obliged. If you would like to read a bit more, but don't buy it and stuff. I always don't want to do that thing where people say, buy my book. No, I'll just give you a free bit, but don't tell the publisher anything. And but in it, I started to think a lot about, this whole kind of question of like non-binary. And, obviously among my students, there's a lot of non-binary students, so we have a lot of conversations about it. But it's also spending time looking at indigeneity theory and remembering that knowledge, whose knowledge is it anyway? Who created this knowledge? Who created this discipline or this epistemology? So it's moving into states of pre-knowledge, this idea that actually we know everything already, we're just rediscovering it. It's understanding that while science is all about duality and humanities is all about dualism, so what's the difference, guys? these things, these segregations are all manufactured and artificial, and they're not serving our interests. They're not serving the interests of the future, that's for sure. And of course, these epistemologies, these categories, why were they created again? Oh yes, because it was a way of segregating knowledge. It was a way of saying some people's knowledge is inferior and this is better. It was a way of shutting down the sophistication of societies that were 5,000 years old and yet were not oppressive. We do not live in an advanced society. Advanced societies happened already, and they were pushed out, or they were obliterated, or they were colonized. We don't live in an advanced society. And, disciplines, think about it, disciplines, there's something a bit BDSM about disciplines, let's be honest, whips and chains, control, bosses. What is wrong with that already in the word? And this taxonomy, first of all, it always sounds a bit like a mortuary in there, doesn't it, taxonomy? But, this idea of taxonomizing knowledge is about creating hierarchies that serve who? These are always the questions. So last book, I gave a copy to your superstar boss over there, who I'm sure will do that secret, photocopying it in the bathroom. And in the introduction, I have a little bit of a kind of, I'm writing this book using a colonial piece of infrastructure, which is an academic book, to try and have an argument with colonialism. So this is a bit of a problem, might be a bit of a hypocrite. So if you'd like to read, my internal struggle for 12 pages, be my guest. But it was interesting because there's lots of chapters on architectural pedagogy, but a lot is transposable because I think it's all of our struggles with our disciplinary origins and the obligations of teaching core knowledge, which is often actually a way to make people completely turn people off right at the beginning by teaching again about a very specific demographic who more often than not are a bunch of old white blokes, right? And again, prescriptions and their roles, the obligations they carry, where they make us carry, where is their mandate for us to become more sustainable, to become more inclusive? They have agency that we lack as educators, and we really need to see more in what they prescribe. So all of these, partitions of knowledge, of course, come back to questions of who benefits. And so as an exercise, and I would strongly encourage you all as subject, as disciplinary people, to have a little moment tonight, glass of Chardonnay, sit down with your discipline and start thinking about the ways it relates to lots of other disciplines, and just realize actually all of these things, what they produce in a way is the love child of everything, which is architecture, or you could say another discipline, because it's a game that you could play in any direction, right? And so these partitions aren't powerful in the way that they think they are. We get terribly obsessed about them. So the book that I wrote, that I mentioned, showed a nice picture of earlier, it was really trying to understand what does global South pedagogy look like, because coming back to this question of prescription, it's again this idea that, if we're saying architecture across the world, we're saying how do all the colonized countries of the global South enjoy the prescription of architecture? How are you getting on with a deployment of this ideological imperialist agenda a few centuries later? But it was also, so that was a kind of bad side of what I was trying to do, self-admission. But the other side of it was trying to look at how they had in some ways used it and disrupt, to push back, to create different, if you like, interpretations of what they've been prescribed to do through these validation systems. Lots of fun working with students on drawings that say things better than I can in half an hour. And this was my concern, to what extent is this discipline that's coming from this tradition, literally from a group of imperialists perpetrating imperialisms. And that was the question. So, you go to architecture school and you spend the first 3 years being tortured to think that architecture is the story of 5 white guys who wear glasses. So it turns out lots of black. And you get shown pictures like this and told, well, this is primitive and this is advanced. So let's take a look at that. So in my School of Architecture books, primitive, was defined as sustainable. It was designed as locally sourced. It was built collectively using, no shipping, just immediate materials from local community. Nobody gets sick living in these buildings, don't get sick building syndrome. Don't have issues around spending millions every year heating and cooling the space. And actually everyone in the community got literally to have a hand, quite literally, physically, in the making of this thing. So strong stakeholder co-creation and engagement in the end product. All these things architects claim about what they do. And then, of course, you look at something that's positioned as advanced architecture, one of the great American architects. So, here you have Mies van der Rohe, you can building, on the lectures, all the furnitures get made to listen to and memorize. And you're looking at projects where you have what we call, it's a hemispherical, meaning it's literally made from mostly not America. Most of the materials in this building were shipped. Most of them were extracted under impoverished labor conditions, some degree of slavery. They came thousands and thousands of miles to get here. And once they got here, then there were people obviously risking life and limb, in many cases not winning in the battle to produce this thing. It's very hard, by the way, to find statistics about people who die on building sites. Funny that, isn't it? Because it happens all the time. And so there you see that, you know, to have this wonderful facade, not just using steel, but wanting to have this effervescent light shining off of the building, brass had to be used. And actually you start to look at the cost of this year in, year out over decades. And of course, you look at any one material and the toxicity of it, and the fact that its maintenance and current use costs millions in fossil fuels just to keep it air conditioned and the elevators working. And this is allegedly advanced architecture. So you can see the problem, right? So I like to do collages. This is one, hence me doing lots of pictures all the time. Very pictorial, dyslexics, you know, champion, etc. Look, if there's a picture, you've got my attention. Otherwise, forget it, I'll start doodling and you think I'm not listening, but I'm kinetically learning, I promise. This is the provocation, isn't it? That, you know, in some ways, teaching these orders becomes a subjugation of who I am as a teacher, who I am as an educator. It's like me switching off onto, I don't know, cruise control, but leaving, I don't know, Big Bird at the helm, saying, don't crash the plane. So I think there's something really problematic about the fact that whether I like it or not, I am a purveyor of a colonialist, imperialist, slavery encumbered narrative around what constitutes architecture production. And I have to, that's the struggle, right? This is where the prescriptions kick in, or they should. So clicky clicking not working. Help with clicky click, or should I try that way? There we go. So what, you know, what does that mean then? Well, first of all, we're all going to teach on the lawn from now on a picnic cloth. No, but there is a confrontation, of course, of institutions. We talk about people being institutionalized. And it's funny because I often describe my job as working in the qualification sector. I don't like to use the term education sector because I think education happens more often outside of institutions rather than in them. And I've got some real squabbles, if you like, with institutions and what they're doing right now, especially in this country, which is the only country in the world, by the way, that your student debt is hereditary. So your children end up with your student debt, and everywhere else in the entire universe gets written off, just saying that's not okay. Another form of slavery. So these things, of course, you know, brilliant thing about the Enlightenment was, I always think Enlightenment is such a polite way of describing a front of house for the brutality of, if you like, the peak of colonialism and exploitation. So you might need to be my clicker. Maybe the battery's died. So we talk about decolonizing the curriculum a lot, and everyone gets terribly enthusiastic. And then you ask anyone to give an example of how they're doing it, and everyone looks terribly worried. But it really starts with telling stories about who you are. Because I think there's something, first of all, in understanding that who teaches it and their relationship with what they're teaching is really key. I obviously adapt definitions of things. I tend to not like anybody's version of my experience, but I think it's always a good place to start with teaching, to ask students to think, what does decolonization mean for them? And letting them set the brief, hence giving them so much agency through the autodidactic, meaning student-led educational experiences at Pratt that I did. Another picture. So I think one of the things that, you know, and apologies that I jump between English and American spelling of words, bad habit, but, you know, this thing about decolonization, first of all, I got lots of people when I gave my kind of, we're going to decolonize the school talks in the middle of the Black Lives Matter protests a couple of summers ago. Very lovely people coming in saying, oh my God, am I now relevant? And actually, no, decolonization is not about losing knowledge. It's not about replacing it. It's really very much around adding in, because without having that mix, you haven't got the means through which you can contest old ideas. If we denied the existence, for example, you know, of Hitler, what would that do? Or even the Holocaust, if we said, let's not teach that because it's traumatic, let's only focus on things that are not about that story. What does that then do in terms of understanding the framework of new knowledge or different terms of experience or terms of references of experience relative to that event? So it's critical that we keep that content in the canon. And then, of course, pedagogies by implication are the means through which, you know, it's kind of the kind of verb of, if you like, well, actually more of the adjective of the verb, in that one has to start to act out in some ways what this decolonization project can look like. And I think with Audre Lorde's example, this was in one of those, I laid awake at night thinking about this a lot, which I shouldn't really do because there's nothing I can do about it. But, you know, she's right in many ways, I think, to address the fact that it's very hard when you went from inside an institution to change it, when an institution itself is, you know, a conglomeration and a calcification of old ideas that are tied to notions of tradition, which is another euphemism often for imprisoning us all in outdated and often prejudicial infrastructures and processes. So last story bit then, strategies. And how much longer have I got? 10 minutes? Yeah, 10 minutes, perfect. Cool. Tactics, why do I say tactics? Well, you know, I gave a couple of examples, didn't I? I said tactics, tools, strategies, just in case anyone has issues with the etymology of any of these, you know, you can make up another one. Has to rhyme though, you know, I like my iambic pentameter and iteration. So tactic one, resisting linguistic violence. If you think about architecture, and I'm obviously encouraging you not to do it too long, because it's bad for your health. But the first thing is to say that there's a lot of linguistic violence in our field. I mean, just the fact that students have to go through juries or crits, as we call them, that and the idea of a submission. Again, it's very much the language of violence, very much the language of, you know, this discipline, this aggression in the transaction of assessment that advantages some students over others. It's not a measure of true performance or ability. It's actually more of a personality test. It's like Myers-Briggs after, I don't know, a week working night shifts, who's just eaten a packet of ProPlus. That's really what it is. So I think, you know, Judith Butler's right to point out that, you know, it needs to be new terminologies, new frames of reference for assessment processes. This is a real picture. This is a Delft School of Architecture. You know, the students have created a crying room. The crying room, as you can see, crudely rendered in masking tape, is where they go to cry after their reviews. And what's interesting about, you know, the role then that the school plays in this should be outrageous. You know, we have a mental health crisis amongst college students. You know, and here we are with this, you know, this kind of ironic space as an acknowledgement, and the fact that there isn't immediately some people there. I mean, fine, if there needs to be a crying room, then I think there should be food and beds and, I don't know, unicorns running around in costumes, but something, some mitigation besides sitting on the floor behind, I don't know, a piano in its blanket, whatever that thing is. But it's also outrageous that this conditioning of this environment in having this at all, not to sort of recognize that is a temperature check on just how toxic this environment is and to do something about it. And it's actually giving students budget, time, resources to go off and run their own protests. In Radical Pedagogies, I wrote about this school, bunch of students who just couldn't be bothered to pay fees anymore, decided to do you know, an autodidactic, each one teach one model of education, and found an abandoned shop and finished their final year of their degree across 3 disciplines, interior design, architecture and art, teaching each other and then submitting and getting a degree anyway through the Open University. So they just thought, actually, this is going to save us a ton of money, and they were right. They knew enough after 2 years, they knew they didn't need a 3rd year. And then, of course, you know, people talk about globalization or the great leveler. Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's not. And actually, this homeless professionalized concept is how some people, I won't say which, you know, management organization writers have said this, but this kind of, you may remember Theresa May, one of the many, you know, oh dear, the Prime Ministers of England, you know, cartoon sketch. But she actually said after the Brexit vote that we're all citizens of nowhere. And that I spent a lot of hours really antagonizing what she said. And I think in things I've written about, but this idea, of course, that globalization is some sort of great, you know, I don't know, like invisible infrastructure of transportation between regions, roles, opportunities, and it's not. It's just another form of entrenched segregation between wealthier economies and those that are in the service of the wealthy economies. But it comes back to things like international style in architecture, notions of what we think to be international style, of course, just meaning, you know, colonialism under another name. So another tactic is to think about indigeneity. For example, when you're in New York and you're talking about indigenous planting, what does that mean when we've got migratory species? What does it mean when this entire city is built of diaspora and people, some brought here without any say in the matter, others fleeing persecution to be here? What, when the nutritional needs relevant to their diets are very, very different. So your physical anthropology determines what you can and can't digest easily and what is nutritious for you. So there's a whole big dialogue about how we activate the city to think not just around trying to save the residual species, but the invasive species that are fleeing temperature shifts further south or from the north, in fact. And similarly, the diaspora and peoples here with their different dietary needs. So it's complicated. There's questions, of course, about this intersectionality theory. You're probably all familiar with Kimberly Crenshaw's work in 1991. But then it's understanding that the intersecting of these omissions is not just an acknowledgement, it's a mandate. So what does that look like? We're going to intersectionalize, if you like, different source of information into one proposition. It's less about acknowledging multiple oppressions and more about using that as agency to change things. It's about recognizing that within making, you know, there remains inequalities. So while we're sat there saying, oh, let's build it out of core 10 or boulders, who's going to cut that boulder? what are the extractive geographies, the supply chain economics, if you like, the kind of the hidden values associated with shipping things from across oceans that were extracted from the earth and devastated a rainforest, and it was children who were extracting it. And I think also participatory pedagogies. This is actually photos when I was working in Serengat refugee camp when I used to live back in England. But this idea of obviously designing for the real world, really coming from a willingness to actually just not take some nice ideas from somewhere exotic and bring them back to New York, but actually do the work in this distributed classroom sense in at the sites of, if you like, where the harm or the challenges are happening. And this idea about co-designing dissenting non-discipline. So I fly to Joburg on Saturday, where right now there's no energy left. So they have these power shedding portions of every day because they can't turn on the electricity. So everybody has to stop work and stop anything. So it's dangerous. You know, certain services have this. The students are protesting. No one's paying fees. It's kind of turned into the Wild West. And I got sent this email saying this is happening and this is happening. And I wrote back, conditions are perfect. Exactly where I need to be right now, having conversations with them, listening to them about what needs to change. And also this understanding, of course, that everything we do here has a consequence. Right now, there is a ton of aquatic, well, human waste bundled up with loads of dead aquatic life, the size of Russia that oscillates in the ocean between Japan and California. And it is actually the size of Russia. So we could all go and live on it eventually, floating around the place. But it's like, you know, the nothing that we throw away ever goes away. And more acutely, of course, it's always been the case that where the global North's crimes are enacted on the global South. And it's not, if you like, it's over. We are now reaching this sort of tipping point where now we are all having to actually confront the horrors that we've enacted on those communities for centuries. I'm very interested in the work. If you have not been to the museum, seen the Afrofuturist show there, you really should, it's brilliant. But it's very interesting looking at what alternative visions of the world look like that aren't about being frightened of artificial intelligence or going back to an enactment of what was once labeled primitivisms, but understanding there's a relationship between the two because time is non-linear outside of Western culture. And that's a very long talk for later. But this idea, of course, about recovering lost wisdoms, understanding that the very land on which we're stood is all about that. That's the pedagogy of the place we are in. How do we connect to that? And of course, bibliographic injustice, very much around the reading list. I've done a lot of work on this. But I think it's very interesting to think about, you know, work is not about having neutrality. I'm sure, you know, you've heard about the gay penguin situation and DeSantis's protest against that. There's no such thing as having books that do not take a position. And I think that's very important to remember while we're being told to stay neutral all the time, whatever that might mean. And so I think it's understanding that as pedagogues within the infrastructure, as pedagogues, we are former slaves or maybe contemporaneous slaves, depending on your employers, you know, being nice or not. But this idea, of course, is that we are working operationally with an infrastructure that was intended to be prejudicial, was intended to segregate, it was intended to create hierarchies and to disadvantage, as much as it was to create advantage and to create opportunity. So somewhere in that, our conscience lies, and that becomes our challenge. So eventually, perhaps we might have a little bit of a break from thinking we've got all the solutions, look into another species, something like mycelia, most sophisticated form of life in the entire universe, communicates, gets all the trees and every living thing in the forest floor to communicate, does all the things that, by the way, we don't do, thriving on waste matter and living in an autonomous and, while at the same time, profoundly connected and sustaining way. But it's understanding, as I said before, that this has to be a principal approach when thinking about what constitutes sustainability. And to thank you very much for listening to my long story. I think I'm more or less on time, hopefully not too late, with 5 minutes for questions, but thank you. Well, I don't know, you've heard a bit about what's happening at the Earth core. So yeah, no, maybe we should turn that off. It's only a bit, it just shows that temperature changes and the next boost. But yeah, I think you're right. It's a bit of a trigger image. I should have put one of the kittens at the end next time. But yeah. It's great. Thanks.
Hi, how are you? Just a question about, you had the Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere map. If we were just in terms of America, the rest of the Northern Hemisphere aside, if we were to avoid the globalization of taking advantage of the South and their materials and natural resources and do everything in America, us withdrawing from those countries, what do you think that impact would be on the rest of their economies and the people in those countries?
Oh, that's really, yeah, it's a really nice question. And yeah, it's definitely like Global South is not hemisphere based, as I'm sure you know, because there are rich countries in the Global South. But yeah, it's in terms of their ability to feed themselves, to actually, you know, have economies that are autonomous and actually use their resources to, I think, recover a lot of the exploitation. If that's the question, like what would, if there was a, you know, as a bit like with the pandemic, when everybody stopped being able to travel around quite so much, if people started to just look to become regionally autonomous, I think that they're better placed to survive than we are, to be completely frank. So in North America, you think about the population, think about, you know, scale of farming relative to the scale of need, you think about the lifestyle choices we have here. The countries that will be worst affected by what the climate, if the climate ends up, if you like, obliterating our ability to kind of have these trade relationships, these independent relationships, which are still predicated on exploitation of global South countries. If that fell apart tomorrow, we're the ones that would be more vulnerable because we have, our dependency on those regions is so extraordinary that we lack any real autonomy to feed ourselves, provide enough energy, all that kind of thing. So the interesting thing is that they're going to be all right once, if you like, our claws are off them. It's the countries in, you know, what is not really classified in a political sense as global North, but, you know, in the rendering of global South, those countries outside of that are the ones that are going to face the problems, if that answers the question.
Students. As an educator of secondary students, first of all, your talk was fascinating. You know, I worry about the social, emotional, mental health implications of the unknown, right? So how do we create more hope?
Thanks, it's such a lovely question. Yeah, I think, well, first of all, we had a chat earlier, didn't we, about math, which English people, British people mistakenly call maths. Let's take a bit of a story about embodied energy, right? So embodied energy, we know that, you know, if you burn a chip, however long it takes to burn, tells you, you know, it's either its calorific value or its ability to, if it's a building material, it's the value in terms of its extraction, production, installation, economics, what tells you how much the real cost of it is. You know, it's not the tree you cut down or the person you pay, it's all of that together. So, but I like to think about it as disembodied energy, because I think that in some ways what we don't do is think about the human factors. So, for example, you know, when you think about a piece of steel, it's not just the fact that somebody extracted it possibly under poor conditions, it's the fact that that person's life is then shorter because of working in those conditions. It's the fact that their kids lose their parent young. It's the fact that their parents' health bills cost more, that restrict their children's ability to go to college. So there's all these kind of, like, you know, if you like, spin-offs of the economic implications of these things that are a type of math that I think is really interesting, but we don't really talk about it. But I think it's one of those intersecting with the humanities way of understanding what a number is, you know, what math really is. It has a social dimension to it. So I think similarly, the easiest game to play is always osmosis, isn't it? You know, reverse osmosis is to think about how things could be done differently. And, you know, there are, for example, just as an architecture example, right now there's a practice called Rotork who don't build anything until they've deconstructed it first. So they take apart an existing building and then they reconfigure it just differently with contemporary aesthetics, but all the same materials. So they never have to buy anything new. So there's something about the way that we, in some ways, we've left a kind of Pandora's box meets toy box for the next generation. You know, there's some really scary stuff in there, but there's a lot to play with. And I think it's understanding the utility of what we have, because we have enough. We already have enough. Our lives are rich. And we have the wrong metrics. See, I knew this, I was going to make this about math, I promised, didn't I, earlier? But it's true, because what's the measure of a student's worth? It's really, they take that worth when they see what we value. We teach them a valuable thing is to earn X amount of money, or have this car, or buy this house, or go to this school. And there's a different metric system outside of all of that that we have to help them find and define for themselves. you know, and that's, I think, the problem. So it is around that shift in understanding what is true value, what can you do with what you have, a lot more than you think. And outside of the existing infrastructure of assessment and classification, you're good, you're bad, you're a failure, all of that, beyond that, there's a whole other value system. And that's where the hope is situated.
Back to Professor Harris. Is there anybody here that has had a story of the in which they thought of something differently and made a student feel more inclusive? Because even if they're they don't have the knowledge, they have pre-knowledge, as Professor Harris said, you know, just a student in your class or a time that you've had that, you know, maybe we can share it with each other, and just to help us think about how do we be more creative about being inclusive, or thinking about the opposite, or, you know, thinking of the void kind of thing, and being able to fill that space. Anybody have a story? I know you guys have lots of stories. I know you guys do that every day. Anyone? Anyone? All right, well, maybe, oh, yes, see, I knew there was one that wanted to share. I know everybody has one here. Just as
Hi. I don't know if it's exactly what you're asking for, but so we have a student in our school this year who's on the spectrum also, and I think it's very easy. We've probably all seen it where like a student like that can fall through the cracks, where they're just seen as like, oh, they're just not engaged, or they don't have the skill, or whatever. And so I just like credit to the special ed team at my school. We got together and we had like a voluntary meeting with some of his teachers, and we kind of came up with like a behavioral plan to help him stay focused. And like, for example, he now puts his phone in the front of the class where he can see it. He has a kind of like a check-in sheet that he fills in at the beginning and end, just like monitoring his like behaviors and like, did I stay in my seat? Did I stay on task? Did I not get in other people's like personal space and things like that? And he's really blossomed a lot. He's much more, I mean, he always had like a wealth of knowledge where sometimes he would just kind of like explode, and like if there's something interesting on the board, he'll just talk. So I think it's just kind of focused him, and he's definitely improved across the board. And I think it just speaks to like what you're saying. Not everybody learns this one way that we've kind of been prescribing for a very long time. So sometimes it is about just building in these different ways to empower people with what they have, to give them, you know, the skills to move forward and grow.
I think that's really beautiful. I love the idea. It's like Knowles's learning contracts, isn't it? Where, you know, you get this student to basically define what they see as the measures of success for their day within the school environment. I think that's absolutely wonderful. And I think I probably should do that for myself. Did I stay on topic? Did I finish on time? But yeah, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
Of a 10-minute break. So use bathroom, and we're setting up for the fireside chat. So you're welcome to walk around, and the bathrooms are that way.
Test. Testing. 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 Yep.
Everyone's there.
Oh, right.
Will everyone please get seated? We're about to get started again.
All right. Welcome back, everybody. Since I'm going to start with some questions to allow you to introduce yourself, let me just quickly introduce myself to everyone. My name is Brian Deutsche. I work with Con Edison. I'm very proud that Con Edison supports WISE, and I am so lucky to have been introduced to WISE a few years ago. I've been helping out on the EDGE Council and working in, I want to say 5 or 6 different schools between Manhattan and Brooklyn over the last few years, virtually and now back in person, which is great. Able to meet at this point hundreds of students and really loving every minute of it. Both my parents were teachers. We've been throughout this morning talking about that link to the classroom, and I grew up in the classroom, not just at school, but also whenever I was sick, going to my parents' school and seeing them teaching. And I love the opportunity of getting back in the classroom. So really thankful to WISE and really glad that Con Ed is able to support this effort. So without further ado, I have Matthew Barhydt here with me, and I want to give you a chance to first introduce yourself, and then we'll get into some of these questions.
Sure. So Matt Barhydt, very happy to be here. I've taught some seminars for WISE on buildings and sustainability and design. I was formerly a partner at a Midtown firm called Adjacent Door Partners Architects for 11 years. I left about a year ago deciding that I wanted to pursue some more creative opportunities. Most of the work that I've done in my career has been in the New York City area, variety of projects, some new construction, residential, institutional, a lot of historic rehabilitation and restoration projects. So very happy to be here. My stepmother was an educator. My sister, special education educator and administrator. So I have the utmost respect for teachers and anybody in the education profession.
All right, well, we're going to start by going backwards a little bit and going back to when you were first deciding that becoming an architect, going into architecture might be the thing for you. So can you just talk a little bit about what were the influences when you were making that decision?
So I think somewhere in high school, I became interested in becoming an architect. I didn't really know what it was. I think it was around the time, strangely enough, where we were moving from an apartment and we were moving into a residential development, and I could actually see the house getting built. And I got really excited about that. And then there was an opportunity by local Boy Scout troop. There was kind of, I don't even remember what it was called at this point, but there was an ability within the Boy Scouts, if you were interested in different careers, there was a group of professional architects who would meet with some of the scouts, every month or two in their office, kind of show them what they were doing and what it was all about. So I had a vague notion of what architecture was and that I wanted to be an architect, but didn't really discover what that meant till I got into school.
So in your high school, was there anything programmatically that were you able to take any architectural drawing classes, anything like that? Or this is all on the outside in the Boy Scouts?
On the outside, and I know that things have changed. We can talk about that in a couple of minutes, but no, there was really nothing. And I didn't have any examples. I didn't know any architects. There were no architects in the family. So it was kind of a big leap of faith that this is something that I really wanted to do.
And as I was thinking about this conversation, thinking about the audience and that we have teachers here who have the chance to then go back to their classrooms and talk to students about things that maybe there's no way for a teacher to know everything about everything. So I feel like this is a great opportunity to give teachers some of these tools. So then if they have a student that says, oh, I might be interested in this, they now can hear from you and hear from everyone else that's spoken today about what architecture can really offer. So that's really great to hear. And I'm glad you had a chance to share that. Now you've decided to go into architecture, you get to college. What is that experience like? What is the experience of going to architecture school and becoming an architect?
So let me answer that, but let me kind of back into that by acknowledging that I went through the same educational system that Dr. Harris so well critiqued. I've gone through the same professional, let's just call them opportunities or challenges that Dr. Harris also very well critiqued. But even that being said, I think there is a lot of benefit to pursuing an architectural education because I think, as she did point out in a lot of ways, there's a lot of interconnectedness there with other fields, with other ways of thinking. So, I mean, practically speaking, potential student needs to get accepted into an architecture school, but there is a difference between just going into architecture school and becoming a registered architect. So getting into architecture school is a certain application process, like it might be for other professions. It might be showing a portfolio, things that you did in art class in high school, or some of the programs now that exist in high schools, CAD drafting, whatever it might be. But students who want to pursue actually becoming a licensed architect are required to get what's called a first professional degree. So that is either a Bachelor of Architecture, which is typically a 5-year degree, what we used to call like a 4-in-1. It's a Bachelor of Arts, 4-year degree, and then it's a 1-year Bachelor of Architecture. Although I think some schools now are just sort of rolling that in together. Or it's a Master's of Architecture degree. And a lot of people that I've worked with over the years, they went to undergraduate school in something completely different, business, whatever it might be, and then decided along the way that they were really interested in architecture, and they applied to graduate school and were accepted. And strangely enough, a lot of graduate schools actually like people coming into the profession from another field, because then they bring something else to it. So if you have students out there that are asking about it, it's really, do I want to go into architecture school and see where that leads me? And decide along the way if you really want to become an architect or do something else.
Now, I went to school that had engineering, art, architecture, and I used to think of it in its most basic form as you have engineering on one side, art on the other, and then architecture kind of somewhere in the middle. And probably a little closer to the art side than the engineering side, but always pulling from both of them. In an architecture program, is there a math and science core to it also, or is it more closely resembling like a fine arts type of program typically?
So I think one of the biggest fears students have that when they think about going into architecture is, oh no, I'm not that good at math, I'm not that good at science. I'm here to tell you that that's okay. I was one of those students that I was at best a B+ student in math, and I would have been happy to be a B+ student in science. But most undergraduate programs, at least for those first couple of years, you're going to take the same core classes in college that almost anybody else takes. So it's not, I wouldn't let that hold somebody back.
Very good to know. Now, there's a topic that was discussed briefly just before our break that I think is important to talk about, and that is one of diversity. Diversity in architecture. Again, we just discussed it, but there has been criticism, just like in engineering, a lot of criticism about diversity in engineering, and it's something that Con Ed we're very cognizant of, and we're trying to do our best to change. Can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, what you've seen from how you're trying to shift the lack of diversity in the architecture space right now?
So it's still unfortunately an issue. When I was helping to run my firm, we would place an ad for a new designer. We were always very disappointed that we weren't getting a lot of diversity in our application pool. We were not getting a lot of women. We were not getting a lot of young people of color. And I think, and again, I think Dr. Harris kind of alluded to this in several different ways. It still is, to a certain extent, kind of an old white man's profession. I mean, I can remember going to construction meetings at building sites and looking around the table, and there still would be, 90% of the people there were white and male. But one of the things that my office did that I was able to get them involved in, and some of you may be familiar with this already in your schools. So there's a great mentoring program here in New York City. It's called the ACE Mentoring Program of Greater New York. And these are teams of volunteer teams of architects, construction professionals, and engineers under the guise of the ACE program who work with students in New York City high schools, and now I think in Westchester and Nassau County during the school year to essentially put together a mock project. So they'll meet in the fall. The students will decide what kind of project that they want to design and build, and they will work with their mentors throughout the school year, and then they present the projects in the spring. So they are getting a sense of the, sort of jury process that Dr. Harris alluded to, but it's a positive process. It's also an opportunity, if students haven't done any public speaking before, at least amongst their peers, to be able to present the projects. But I think critically also is the ACE organization offers scholarship money. So I was fortunate, I was on the scholarship committee for 7 or 8 years with ACE. And annually ACE gives out, just in the New York City area, like $200,000 in scholarships. And my firm sponsored one of those scholarships. So the point I'm trying to make is, at least at the high school level, there are initiatives to try to widen that pool of possible students who are interested in engineering or something in construction and something in architecture. And it was pretty amazing just being able to read some of these scholarship applications, which were essay-based, because these students would discover during the years, for example, they may start out like, I want to become an architect, but getting to work on a project with professionals, I don't know how many times that I read a student saying, oh, I thought I wanted to be an architect and now I want to be a mechanical engineer. It's like, lost another one. But so my point is, it is starting in the high school level. That's where it needs to start. Where there isn't enough support is at the college level. I know that ACE is starting to try to address this, in some areas. It's now a national program. But it's still, there needs to be help for students to actually, once they're in college, to actually get through it in some sense, and then feeling comfortable, working in the profession. The American Institute of Architects has kind of a diversity program now, but how that really translates on the local level, I think is still, still not really there yet.
We'll try our best. So now just moving a little bit more towards what our overarching theme is for the day, of this idea of buildings and sustainability and sustainable cities. So LEED certification is something that has been around for a little while now. I remember when it was first coming out, right after I graduated from undergrad. Can you talk a little bit about what LEED certification is, and maybe how it's evolved, and what it means to be LEED certified versus what it means for a building to have a LEED certification of some sort?
Sure. So LEED may be one of these buzzwords that you've heard, may not be entirely familiar with, but I am LEED accredited, meaning that I have an additional level of training, so leadership in energy and environmental design. LEED is a program that started in the design and construction industry probably about 25 years ago. Really started this whole discussion about sustainability and how we change the design practice and how we integrate this to the way that we design and build buildings. So a building that is LEED certified, and there are different levels of it, they've met certain benchmarks, not only in energy, but in making sure that it's a healthy building. There's no off-gassing from any of the interior products. The landscape is treated in a sustainable way, the water runoff, the way that we deal with the whole environment. So it really became kind of a badge of honor. It's gotten to the point now where a lot of those practices have been incorporated in design, both in engineering and architecture, but it's still something notable.
And then as we move towards this idea of net zero and buildings with carbon neutral buildings and net zero emissions, is that becoming part of the LEED certification, or is LEED now something that it kind of opened this ideas and now the general public or the people that are making these decisions now have that understanding, so it's not as big of a deal anymore? Is it still relevant? Just kind of personally get a feel for where it is in kind of the public space right now.
So net zero basically means that your building is not using any more energy than it's producing, or it's not producing any more than it's using. So what that really means is you can, to a certain extent, take it off the Con Ed grid, It may be a combination, maybe it's solar panels, it's geothermal, but it's also the way that you think about designing the building envelope to minimize air infiltration. So it's a higher standard. It also has cost implications. It is something that initially developed in Europe, sort of came out of, okay, what's next after LEED? And it's not necessarily, it shouldn't be really one or the other. But if anybody's familiar with the new Cornell campus out on Roosevelt Island, which sort of started with the Bloomberg administration, those buildings were mandated to be net zero buildings. In other words, they don't use any more than they produce. Some buildings actually produce more energy than they need at certain times, and they throw it back to the grid.
Absolutely. Looking for more and more of those and how we can figure out a distribution system that allows for that. Now, throughout your career, you've worked on a number of projects in and around parks and park settings, where I'm sure there's a lot of thought going into how the structure fits into the ecological setting. So can you talk a little bit about the differences in mindset and maybe how you approach a project that may be tied more closely to park or a natural setting versus something in just a strictly urban setting? Or do you approach them in the same way, and are you looking for the same goals kind of?
Well, having done some projects for the National Park Service, I think one thing that comes out of that is just for really a respect for the landscape and the site that otherwise sometimes we might take for granted. I mean, I'll give you one example is I oversaw design and construction for a retail pavilion on Liberty Island about 10 years ago that was LEED Platinum certified. We were mandated by the National Park Service essentially to minimize the way that we touch the landscape. It's an historic site. And for a number of reasons, we ended up raising the building on steel piles to minimize our impact on the landscape. I just think that that's kind of a good design approach. Obviously, in an urban and tight environment like this urban environment, there are different constraints. But I do think that we always need to talk about the site and even how we deal with water and utilities and everything that's touching our building.
I appreciate that. And as an engineer who has friends who are engineers who work a lot with architects, one in particular used to say like the architect would come with this brilliant idea of what they would like to do. And then he's like, unfortunately, part of my job is to explain why we can't do it. But it gets the conversation going. And then it may not end up as the original design that you had in mind, but by coming with those different ideas and working with engineers and other folks who come to the table, you get to a place where you've shifted what would have been there in the first place.
And it's a better building.
Exactly. And then the next person who comes with an idea of what they'd like to do, now they don't have to get people to get to this spot. Now we could start here and shift it even closer to what this vision of how they think we can be living, and maybe get to realize it sooner rather than later. So I really appreciate that and think it's a great opportunity for architects to play a role in this idea of creating sustainable cities. So thank you for touching on that. But living, working, being in this dense urban environment, are there ways that the city or people living in the city can make it more livable, make it a better place, like right now? Like, what are some ways that we all can leave here thinking about how we can impact what the city is and what it can become?
Well, I think it happens on a couple different levels. I mean, David kind of alluded to it earlier this morning when he talked about, with our existing buildings, how do we improve our existing buildings just to make them more energy efficient? I think the philosophy that my firm had and that most architecture firms in the city have now is that it's much better to reuse an existing building than to tear down a building and put something up new in its place. just because of all the resources that you're conserving, all the energy that you're not using, and bringing new materials and things like that. So on a smaller scale, where we have the ability in our communities, whether it's participation, maybe it's on a community board, or getting involved in some local community organizations, to be able to preserve what we have as much as possible, I think goes a long way. There's continuously this argument in the city about sort of open space, versus, I can't tell you how many articles I've read about parks that are going to be potentially closed for new housing. It's not a discussion to solve in this room, but there are going to be these conflicts between, obviously, having more green space is healthier. At the same time, the city has a housing crisis. And I think these are issues that students are going to have to deal with that are going to become even more critical. On a larger scale, there are things happening. I'm sure most of you remember the Fresh Kills garbage dump in Staten Island. And at least through the Giuliani administration, all the city's waste was being taken out to Staten Island and dumped, in this huge, for miles and miles and miles. Well, starting about 10 or 15 years ago, that was closed down. But what's happening now is becoming an amazing park. It's a 30-year ecological makeover, where they're literally covering all of that garbage with grasslands, with trees, with ball fields, and it's becoming an amenity to Staten Island residents. So instead of people being unhappy about living so close to a horrible environmental catastrophe, they now are living next to one of the biggest and best green resources in the city. So I think where we have the opportunity of doing those things, it's going to be all for the better.
Yeah, that really is amazing. Takes Staten Island and Fresh Kills, something that's been a punchline to jokes for decades. For anyone who's lived in and around New York City, probably for folks who've never even been to New York City, they think that Staten Island is a landfill. And to now turn it into something where it's usable space and it's beneficial to the people living around it is incredible. And I could imagine the first conversations in those rooms, looking at the design, people probably were just laughing, thinking there's no way this is going to be the end result. Like this is impossible. What are you even talking about? We're not taking this landfill that everyone makes fun of and turning it into something that people want to be around, that want to walk on, want to live near. That's just madness. And it gets back to the idea of we already have all of the materials and resources that we need to survive moving forward. We don't need these 30,000 new products every day. We could take something that's already existing and repurpose it and find maybe an even better use than what was originally intended for.
Exactly.
So to that point, and this is something that I was really curious about, as your career progressed, did you notice a difference across the table when you would have clients come to you with ideas or with looking to you for ideas? Did they have a better baseline knowledge of climate change, sustainability, energy efficiency? Were they coming to you saying, we want to make sure our final buildings check these boxes? Or is it still somewhere where we need to really focus on the overall understanding of everyone in the room?
It's definitely gotten better. I think, particularly with our Liberty Island project, the firm was fortunate to have a client that was already in some ways ahead of us, and this is something that he took pride in being able to achieve, to get to LEED Platinum, which was the highest rating. And I think in general now, just because it's become so much of what we have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, our clients were more educated. It was always about energy, which is where it needs to start. As I mentioned before, as a firm and as many firms have done, these practices about making sure that you design a wall that's going to minimize air infiltration, putting the right windows in a building, putting a green roof on a building, all of those things now I think have been integrated into practice, and they're not so much the economic burden that they used to be for a lot of property owners. But there's also a lot of nonprofits and institutional buildings. And somebody asked earlier about the schools here in New York City. I don't know what the statistic is. I have a feeling it's very high. But New York City, between its schools and all of the other buildings it's hundreds of those buildings that need to be part of this makeover. Often we saw with nonprofit and institutional clients that for good reason, they were very budget conscious. If you're a nonprofit, you've got X dollars to try to achieve a renovation, whatever it might be. And sometimes you can't think ahead that, okay, if I invest this much money now, my operational costs are going to be lower in the future, because that's a different budget and that money isn't there yet. So it's always, it's going to continue to be a dialogue, as it should be, I think, between architects and engineers and their clients. But with some of the new laws coming on board that David spoke about this morning, about having to do benchmarking now in buildings and getting to certain levels of sustainability and efficiency, or facing fines, there's kind of a forced educational process going on with some of the larger, maybe less sophisticated property owners.
And is cost of doing business in New York City, is that still one of the more difficult things to overcome in trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in and around the city? Or are there other factors at play that maybe we don't realize? I can imagine cost would probably be one of the biggest challenges that you might face in trying to make an impact on a large scale in a place like New York.
Yeah, I think it is, and it's unfortunate, and I don't think that it's really been adequately addressed. And it's interesting that that NYSERDA has the Green Bank program, and there are other programs out there like that, because a property owner that within 5 years has to take out the gas-fired boiler that was just put in 10 years ago, that's supposed to last 20 years, and now has to pay for that upgrade, that could be a financial burden. And how do those costs get then passed along? A property owner that owns multiple apartment buildings that at some point is going to have to make the same decision, who's limited by other state laws that limit how much the landlord or the property owner can raise the rent. How do you reconcile those two things? I don't think we've dealt with that. I think it's going to become an issue in the next few years. I don't think we're really at that point, but it is that kind of unanswered question right now.
I agree. And I'm glad I don't have to have an answer to that question either, to be quite honest. And I totally understand everything you're saying there. It's true what we're facing, and what building owners and co-op boards and things like that, the decisions that are going to have to be made in the very near future are going to be difficult, and cost definitely is going to be one of those factors. Now bring it back to education, to one of the reasons why we're here, and thinking about the students in the classrooms and the teachers here who can go back and talk to the students in their classrooms, and talking about what they can do moving forward as far as a career goes. Can you talk about some advice you'd give to students if we're in front of a classroom full of students, or to teachers here, as far as if a student is interested in this idea of architecture, becoming an architect? What's the advice you would give for them?
So the school is obviously a place to start. I think I would find out if there is an ACE mentoring program in my school. Does my school offer computer-aided drafting classes? is there ability as a starting point in my school to start learning these things? Beyond that, there's, for example, there's the Urban Green Council, which is an advocacy group that does everything from advise the city council on new regulation to providing seminars and teaching opportunities, but there's also public lectures. There are schools like Cooper Union, like Columbia, like New York University that often have lectures around these subjects that are open, to students as well as everybody else. There's a local chapter of the American Institute of Architects on LaGuardia Place, which has a great lecture program, which students can go to free or for a very minimal amount. So I think it starts with being curious and being able to find those resources and seek out those resources. Go online, start digging, start seeing what you can find, but ask questions.
And we flashed a different slide on the screen right now talking about careers, and I'm glad we have this up here. I know this is something that we stress during our program when we go in and talk to students, is the variety of careers that you can end up going into. I talk about it from an engineering perspective and from a sustainability perspective, but certainly we're hearing today from an architecture perspective. You're not going to architecture school to say, I'm going to become an architect and design buildings for the rest of my life. So can you talk a little bit about what we have up here and how architecture can prepare you for working alongside or maybe even getting into careers that really focus on something besides designing a building?
So it does start with being curious and that education, at least the beginning, to see what your opportunities are. If you have the advantage of having a mentoring program like ACE in your school, that's a great place to start. But we've heard discussion earlier today about this kind of new green economy and what it might look like. There are opportunities for students now across fields. This is all interrelated. Historic preservation architect, we don't want to take down buildings if we don't need to, but how are we going to retrofit them? How are we going to take a 100-year-old building and now make it energy efficient? We need software engineers. We need computer geeks who can design the programs now, who can design the technology to make new products or come up with new ways of fabricating things for our buildings. We need landscape architects who can think about, okay, what can I do with a site? What are the creative things that can be done? There's engineers, there's mechanical engineers, there's chemical engineers. If we really think through all the facets that's involved in this big discussion about the green economy and sustainability, there is a whole myriad of opportunities available to students. And I hope if you take anything away from this today, and you can bring back to your students, is that there's so much that you can do. We've heard that from other speakers today, but there are so many opportunities out there now that, quite frankly, 10 or 15 years ago didn't exist.
I think that's an excellent place for us to end this portion of the conversation, because I can't think of a better question to allow you to get to that point. So I thank you very much for that. And now we will turn it over to the audience for any questions they may have.
Thank you. Two questions. There's a law in New York City that requires buildings of over 25,000, I think, square feet to be sustainable. Do you think with the problem of, collective action problem, the law should include all businesses and all apartments below 25,000? Because as you said, if there's a cost incentive problem, maybe the government should force all buildings to do that and give them some tax subsidy, because I don't think they'll be investing in any sustainable technology soon. That's number one. Number two, regarding ESG backlash in Texas and I think in Florida, which is coming up, the state in Texas especially said that they won't work with BlackRock Investment Group, which is a sustainable investment company. Do you think, this might not be a question for you, but teachers unions and pension funds are the biggest investors in the United States.
do you think the teachers unions should go away from investment bankings that do not promote ESG? Thank you.
Well, let me answer the first question, because I think I'm a little bit more qualified to answer that. I think what you're alluding to in the size of the building, I think there's a couple things happening. There is a threshold now with commercial buildings and larger buildings, residential buildings, that I think David alluded to this morning, that if you're a certain size and it's already started, then you have to meet these energy benchmarking. Your building has to, and there's a whole law, and it's very complicated. And you do get graded. You do see these like A, B, C, or D little stickers now on doors, like it used to be, it still is for restaurants. On a smaller scale, though, the idea that at a certain point, if you own a 5-unit apartment building and you have a gas-fired boiler and you have to replace it, you are going to have to put an electric boiler in at that time. There is a cost obviously involved in that. How are you going to pass along that cost to your tenants, or can you? I mean, so again, there are certain results from these laws that we really haven't felt the effects of yet, that I think we're going to all, collectively the city's going to have to grapple with in the next few years. I think some of these were passed with very good intentions. And it's terrific to see New York State and New York City taking leadership in this, but it's also going to raise a lot of issues. The second question on investment, I can't answer. I'm sorry, I'm just not qualified.
Let me just add on to a couple things. First, that if you live in Manhattan and you have a gas-fired boiler and you need to switch, there's another option, and that's converting to the Con Ed steam system, which I support in a landmarked power plant over on the west side, actually. So linking it back to the idea of historical landmarks. So there is another option, and Con Ed is looking in ways of making our steam system more green. And the idea of looking at smaller buildings, I think the first step is always to look at the larger entities to find ways of addressing them. And I don't have the numbers in front of me. It would be interesting to see what % of the overall reductions would come from larger buildings versus the smaller buildings, that there are more of them, but they're smaller. And the idea of cost, that the larger buildings probably would have a better chance, I'd say, of having financially the ability of making some of these changes. But it looks like you have something else to say. I don't want to take time away from you to make the next point. No, by all means.
It's just that I forgot the number, but in terms of square feet, the smaller buildings have a higher total square feet, so that's why.
No, you're absolutely right.
I get it.
At some point, they're going to have to be part of the solution.
Yep. And then, okay.
Thank you. I have a question. You mentioned ACE a bunch of times. I've been a big supporter of ACE for about 15 years. Wandy over here and I were actually on a panel last week trying to help promote it in different ways. One of the things I really love about ACE is that they connect with projects that are actually happening live and around the city in various parts, like so the kids can kind of connect with what's happening. You mentioned in your childhood that you kind of got inspired because you saw a building going up around your neighborhood. As teachers, sometimes we just get so caught up in our curriculum, it's hard to necessarily find those projects. So I'm wondering if you could maybe throw out a few that you think would be good for high school students to kind of dive in and explore and redesign, especially around what redesigning or retrofitting a building could look like while still kind of keeping it like fun and engaging so you don't kind of lose interest. That was one of the things that Wandy and I kind of said, like the student goes into a construction project and they're just overwhelmed by the jargon and like all the stuff that goes into it. So how can we kind of give like an entry point with something fun and happening now that they could kind of dive into?
No, I think that's a great question. as you pointed out, through the mentors that are involved in the program, there are periodic trips to see buildings under construction that the professionals, one of the professionals or a group of them may be working on. Sometimes they tend to be the larger projects, but that's a good starting point. This is a lot to bite off, but there's been so much discussion in the press lately about Penn Station. And I think everybody, who spends any time in the city at all somehow comes to touch Penn Station, whether they want to or not. That to me is a huge challenge. There's so many ideas about, what to do with it. Do you get rid of Madison Square Garden? Part of that is there's a New Moynihan Train Hall, which I think has been successful in a lot of ways, but unsuccessful in some. I think that's an interesting project to go into now as a student group and kind of evaluate, what works, spend some time there, what works there, what doesn't work there. And if there's the opportunity, there are a lot of, very good net zero or green buildings going up in the city. Unfortunately, most of them seem to be apartment buildings now, but several in Brooklyn and Queens. There's the opportunity through your mentors to go see one of those buildings and actually get hands-on experience about what it means to sort of design and build a green building. I think that's a great place to start.
Are there some projects going on with national parks or Governor's Island or anything like that that you know of?
The problem with the National Park Service, unfortunately, as with many federal agencies, is there was always the sort of the underlying requirement that the buildings be LEED certified, but there was never the money. And at least in my experience, I mean, the Liberty Island building was a little bit different because it was actually, the client was the concessionaire for the National Park Service. But the other National Park Service projects that I've worked on, particularly the Ryan Visitor, if anybody knows the Ryan Visitor Center out of Floyd Bennett Field and Gateway National Park, both phases of that project were supposed to be sustainable, and there just wasn't the money, to put in the mechanical system that we wanted to upgrade the windows that we wanted to do some of the other work. So I think the state, the federal, and the city agencies are all going to be facing that. Again, I'm curious about how many buildings the city owns and what the DDC is going to do about buildings, what the SCA is going to do about buildings. So it's being forced on the private sector, but I think that's also in a large way where you're going to see the most impact, or at the university level, like maybe at Cornell on Roosevelt Island.
Yeah, and thank you for asking the question and framing it in that way, because I think not having a ton of good examples for you at my fingertips shows an area for improvement, and that all companies don't have these opportunities, especially ones that are in the city, working in the city, serving the city, that we don't have these opportunities to easily bring people in from the classroom to give them this experience. Probably highlights that there's a place to improve. So hopefully the next time I get this question, I'll have better answers, and I'll have 5 or 6 things that Con Ed's doing alone. And there's a good chance that there are 5 or 6 things Con Ed's doing to bring people from high school classes in on projects. But I think this would be a really great opportunity to link the classroom to current projects in this space.
Hi. Oh, wow. I've been on a microphone for a long time. Really quick, I'm coming from the construction point of view. I teach carpentry, and I spent about 10 years working in the field. I'm just kind of wondering, if you take a project and you want to make it LEED certified, what is like sort of the additional cost? Is it like 20%, 30% more than if you would use like standard building techniques?
So I think the good thing now is that The requirements that go into producing a LEED certified building have become so integrated in the design and the construction industry that the additional cost is minimal or even non-existent. I mean, for example, carpentry, FSC certified wood now is something that's commonly specified and a lot easier to get, than it was, 5 or 10 years ago. Where some of the additional cost comes into play is more on the administrative side. LEED, like any organization doing benchmarking, there's paperwork that has to be filled out. There's, you have to provide a certain amount of documentation on the construction side when you're in construction. There's a lot of responsibility for the contractor to document things, the way you dispose of materials, where you dispose of them, how you dispose of them, those kinds of things. So I think there still is an added cost to a project. It may take more design time. And on the energy side, sometimes depending on what level of certification you want to get at, it may mean difference in specifying mechanical equipment or something like that. But I think the good news is that a lot of this has just gotten rolled into good design and construction practices.
I was just reflecting on some of the components from Dr. Harris's talk about how we sustain unsustainable systems and thinking about how to avoid greenwashing in some of our environmental projects, and just reflecting on the example of fresh kills. Like, if that's truly a positive impact on the city, I think we can all agree that adding green space is a good thing. But as she said, our trash just stays with us, right? And so we didn't really divert any of our waste. I think we just now move it somewhere else. And I just worry, are we now kind of participating in that the richer areas of the world kind of just ship their problems off to other parts, and now instead of the landfill being in New York City's backyard where we have to think about it, we now just ship it off to other states and it's in someone else's backyard and no one wants to live near that anywhere.
No, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a very good point. It's something that we have to face and that we have to deal with, but I'm not sure that we should argue the converse of that we should do nothing. I think, to your point, we should be doing both. If we're going to stop dumping it in our backyard, then let's, find a better solution than dumping it in somebody else's backyard. And maybe now, anytime we do one of these things, it's got to be two parts. It's got to be, okay, solve our problem, but don't make it somebody else's problem. I absolutely agree. I don't think we're there yet, but we should be.
So much. Matt will be here through lunch, I think, or longer, the whole day. So you can come up and talk to him. I know there are some residual questions, but for our virtual audience, you're off the hook. We can close now. Please do fill out the survey. We will continue to stream after lunch for one additional session before the data dashboard. So if you want to stay on for, come back in an hour, you can for our virtual audience. But thank you so much, our virtual audience, for attending today. Sorry, I was skipping ahead. So we always talk about transferable skills in schools, right? And then we have this essential skills, which everybody knows. And then there's the soft skills that, we're trying to get our students there, learning about professionalism and being able to connect with people and all the networking and things like that, which the WISE Institute definitely teaches. But my argument is that now there's a new thing called green skills that our students have to know. So now it's essential skills, soft skills, and green skills. The thing is that green skills is coupled with functional or technical skills. So they are transferable skills, but I'm going to make the argument that most functional and technical skills also need green skills going forward. And I'm going to use the data that David mentioned earlier, which is from LinkedIn. And we're also going to look at a study by BCG and Microsoft later on. So just wanted to also say that green skills is different from green jobs. So green jobs is like installing solar panels or being a wind turbine technician, but green skills is the knowledge of sustainability, about climate resilience, all the vocabulary that go with it. Because when we go into to a school and we do our EDGE curriculum, you know, there's a lot of vocabulary that we go over with the students so that they become familiar with the things that we're talking about. And as you know, in your own world, when you talk about sustainability, they're sort of like, I kind of know what that is, but all the vocabulary that goes with it is kind of like, you know, off somewhere and they're not really sure what it means. So I think that we need to arm our students with the vocabulary and the understanding of sustainability and climate resilience. But to be powerful, we're going to couple that with the technical skills like accounting, chemistry, data science. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. So this is the LinkedIn data. So when we started EDGE, we looked at the labor statistics so that we saw that sustainability and green careers were on the rise, 8%. And it's been 8% for a long time. LinkedIn, in their own world, they're calling it LHR, LinkedIn hiring rates. And then, and so they're using their own data to see. And as you can see there, they're tracking that earlier green careers where the one would be equivalent to all hires and green hires, where this one is. Okay. So prior, there are fewer green, fewer green jobs or green skill jobs, but as of between 2019 and 2020, it's on the rise. And you see this, it's beginning to dip, but I think that because of all of these climate issues, it's not going to dip. And and with the BCG and Microsoft information that I'll talk about later, you'll see that the companies are demanding more of those types of skills. All right, so as you can see, the big green dots or the green circles are mainly the green jobs, right? And the light green ones are the green skill jobs. There's risk advisors, there are safety technicians, there's farm manager, construction manager. So they're really functional and technical jobs, but they have they're hiring more green skilled workers. Okay, and I just want you to notice that there's a lot more light green dots than there are dark green dots. Okay, so here's the other aspect that I wanted to point out with you from the data, that education level really counts. I think everybody here, we all want our students to go to college, right? It's okay if they don't, but that's what we're talking about. And many students find that to be the entryway to a better life. And it is for most. So, but as you can see in this chart here, the United States, here. So that means that everybody above this line is talking about they have a bachelor's degree, right? So if they have a bachelor's degree, they might as well know that climate resilience and sustainability type jobs are in demand. Because if we don't tell them that, and our students, public school students, go into college and they do their technical training, but they don't seek out the opportunities to take classes about sustainability and climate resilience, then when they go out into the job market, they may be less competitive. Now, of course, they're smart young people. They go into college, maybe they'll figure it out. But here's our opportunity to give them a head start to look for that. Okay, so the BCG Microsoft study is looking forward. So the LinkedIn is just looking at the data from the last 5 years or 5 or 6 years and seeing how there's this trend for more green skills in a lot of different jobs. But BCG and Microsoft is saying, look, a lot of companies are looking at their greenhouse gas emissions and only 17% of them are actually on track to meet their goals. So what can they do? So the two companies went out to 15 companies, and I'm actually putting up this slide so that you can feel better and we can all feel better, because there's 15 companies that they went out to, but really they only got surveys back from 9 companies. And those 9 companies were really where they're drawing their information from. So as you can see, there are a variety of companies, there are a variety of sectors. All right, so I want you to keep that in mind. And what they saw was that really companies need these types of skills in order to transform to the next level of business, to optimize their business. And of course, they're looking at the things that they've always looked for: functional skills, transformational skills, change management, ambiguity, risk. They're still looking for those. They're still looking for data. They're still looking, but they're adding this sustainability skills that's still evolving because into all of those other areas of their market, of all of their business practices. Okay, so what they're saying is that in order to be a more competitive company or to optimize their company, they need to do these 3 steps. And one is to mobilize and create the catalytic talent. What does that mean? So basically what they're saying is you got to look at your own company and see where there is optimization necessary. And what they're saying is that it's actually in a lot more places than previously thought. So for example, Microsoft says that they've actually hired people now that just do life cycle assessment for their company, which they've never done before. So they're looking across their firm and they're seeing that there are more ways to optimize their companies by being more green. So they, and then so understanding that, they're going to try to embed the talent into every single part of their departments. And as you can see, that's all those light green dots. So for all of your students, the students are going to be looking for different types of careers. They may become engineers, they may become politicians, they may become police officers, but it is very helpful for them to understand that what the challenges are and the vocabulary around it, because many cities now are looking to do different things to help cool cities down. Well, police officers may be involved in that, firemen may be involved in that. So there's the need for understanding green skills is entirely vital. And then what are they saying next? They're saying that, well, we want to accelerate that. So not only is it that they're looking to internally integrate more green skills, they're looking to accelerate that, and they're looking to connect with other scientists. They're connecting with startups in order to create and empower or really power their business to be more green
to mitigate some of the risks that they see are coming. So that is why we feel that it's important to have curriculum that addresses this very issue. That is, that students need to have green skills. So 2016, we put together an advisory committee. And as you can see, they're from a lot of different types of companies because we want to have the input from a lot of different sectors and industries to help our students who may have different ideas of what careers that they want to also learn the sustainability language and vocabulary and information related to the different industries. So that is why our program is more about workforce development in green skills. So we do cover climate change, but we also cover things, the SDG goals, because pollution and biodiversity, those are all important factors going forward. And I know we're very concentrating on climate change right now because of course it's paramount in our mind, but the fact of the matter is all the other things are going to matter too. Okay, so some of the features of EDGE, we have our signature initiative, which is part of our WISE Institute. That's 8 to 10 sessions of high school level seminars on sustainability. And we'll talk about those seminars in a second. And this is across WISE Institute. We always do 8 to 10 sessions with the school. That is having 8 to 10 professionals come into your school, mentors to come into your school, to talk about the relevant issues related to sustainability. And as you know, some of our volunteers are doing other things like training you guys today as well, Brian and Matt. Then of course we have this network of advisors, so you know that the information that we're giving you is the most current cutting edge information that's out there because of our network of advisors. We do have a lot of opportunities. I think before COVID we had more, but we are getting them back for experiential learning and going out to different industries and having community partners. Our internships are back up. So if you guys are your students are looking for internships, please contact Sheila or I because we want to place your students. And then of course we have professional development. So this is kind of the WISE Institute, but also specifically for EDGE. All right, so what are our seminars include? So this is our introduction to sustainability. As you can see, we're at buildings, efficiency and design today, but we've done energy, mobility last year, food the year before. The very first year we did climate change and the carbon footprint, which I know some of you are here for that. And then next year will be materials. And then we will go back to some of the topics we have again to update the information and bring in new speakers. So this is what so our students, your students would be taking every week a session about how is energy impacting sustainability? What are the jobs that are related to that? What are the drivers related to energy? So they'll be learning that on a very organized curriculum and framework so that they can understand the sustainability issues in an easy way. So we're not doing it so that it's so hard and complex that no student can understand it. Believe me, the students are getting it. We have it to the high school level. The other seminar we have, my clicker. I feel like, what is it called? Jeopardy where it's like, my clicker isn't working. Okay. All right. So the other seminar we have, the second one is case studies of sustainable firms. In this seminar, we talk about what is a sustainable business because I think that all of the private sector is going in that direction. And so we want students to understand what is that model. And then we take a look at three major sectors: consumer packaged goods, technology, but we call it sustainable oriented innovation, and energy and the net zero promise. Energy meaning the energy grid. And then the students, after each lesson, they are given a case study. We have a set of questions the students have to answer. It guides their understanding or learning as they do their case. And the students do a presentation. The presentations are to our volunteers. We have our volunteers come in to listen to your students' presentation and give them feedback, which I think the chancellor says is authentic education. We do cloud computing as our technology, but when we talk about sustainable oriented innovation, we really help students understand that many innovations are also have a backlash or have a bad side to it. And we teach the students the life cycle so that they can analyze any particular innovation to see if there is a good side and a bad side to that. And when we look at cloud computing, we hope that the students can learn that. Some students do a better job than that. I think a lot of students feel like cloud computing is so amazing because it's like the internet, it's TikTok, it's everything that they are. But we try to help them understand. And even when they do their presentations, our volunteers are giving them feedback to help them guide them to see that there are all these other considerations that they may want to look into. So that's, and then with the energy game, we have an energetic game in which they actually play a board game to learn about the electric grid. So they have the lesson and then they play the game and then they do a reflection on that. All right. And so this is actually, this is data from just after taking the first seminar, the Introduction to Sustainability seminar. And this is their change in interest in the light blue to the dark blue in STEM. So because the students understand the impact of STEM careers, they're much more interested in that. It's not just like everybody wants STEM careers. No, it's, this is what you can do with your STEM knowledge. So here are some reactions. I put up different ones last year. Every year I'm putting up different ones. But the students are really gaining a lot out of it. And because I think that they realize how much of an impact that is for their work experience. So if your school is looking for more green skill building, we'd love to help. I know that it's always hard to say, okay, well, how do we fit this in? We're doing so much as it is. But usually what we do is we work with your administration, we work with the teachers, and we try to figure out what works best for you. What classrooms can we push in on? Or if pushing in a classroom isn't available, then can we do it as a standalone somewhere in the day? We can start small, or we can go to all of the classes. I think in one of our schools in Brooklyn, we're doing all the 9th graders and we're doing all the 12th graders because they want all of as many of their graduates to have green skills as possible. I was saying to you before, and I'll release these slides as well. Sheila and I are partners in crime. Sheila's right there. And so we're always here to give you assistance and try to figure those things out. And we hope to be in your school. I love for you to come every year to our conference, but we'd also love to be in your schools. Any questions about the program that you'd like to ask now? And of course I'll be around. Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like Sheila should be answering these questions, but yeah, it is, it's usually a class period. It's 45 minutes. I think all of our presenters would love it to be 60 minutes. kills them when the bell rings, but it's 46 minutes or 48 minutes long. So that's generally, and we can push in. Sometimes we have after school as well. So there's some cases where they want to do an after school club to start, but we do push in and we do multiple classrooms in a day. So we do have the whole series for some schools, like all the 9th graders and all the 12th graders, or all the periods for a particular teacher. Is there another? Yeah.
It's not so much a question, it's just a comment. Christy knows me, and I had the opportunity to be one of the volunteers in the classroom a couple of weeks when they did the case studies on Unilever and on cloud computing. So just to sort of echo what Christy was saying, the volunteers that come into the classroom are there to sort of add a sense of realism. When they're presenting the case studies, they're not just presenting it to their friends, they're taking it perhaps a little more seriously, that there's an outsider, sort of an industry expert or a professional that's in the room. So I think that extra dose of realism and accountability is another very good dimension. I enjoyed it, and I really was very impressed by the seriousness that they took these assignments, and to some degree, they're operating outside of their comfort zone. These are very new concepts. And so it sort of forces them to, do some, they can just Google it and they can find out what they need. But to construct some of these PowerPoint slides, it was very impressive. And I just would echo that, it's a terrific program. And I really encourage you to really give it serious consideration.
These are our volunteers, by the way, they're in the room.
Oh, so, one of the things that I think a lot about is systems thinking, right? And so that's really we have to think differently. And what I love about this program, and as volunteers, we get a lot of guidance on, what the WISE team wants us to cover. And I really appreciate the fact that it really is looking at some of these core concepts to rethink how we think, and including, taking a more systems approach, and even just these basic skills of being able to analyze a case and discern it through a more accurate lens, such as impacts across environmental, social, and economic systems. So I think it really has the ability to transform.
Hi, I can speak to the program. I worked with WISE a few years ago, and now I'm back in the classroom, but I'd love to bring it in. We have like a more limited time where it's like 3 weeks after the AP test, honestly, like where we could fit it in. And I don't know what the flexibility is, like doing like 3 weeks instead of the 8 to 10.
Right. So we always had to have the very first lesson, because that lesson is the introduction and the vocabulary and all of that to whatever is coming up after that. But if you'd like, we can select the industries that are most pertinent to your classroom. So you can survey your classroom and say, and figure out what are the most prevalent careers that they're looking for. And then we can go ahead and choose those and put that into the classroom for the 4 weeks instead of the 8 weeks. So as you can see, we're really super flexible, because we just want the students to have the opportunity to hear these words and to have the critical thinking framework that we present to them. Yeah.
I appreciate that. So I teach history, and the AP exam and the Regents exam are giving a lot more attention to environmental themes. And some of you might, also be seeing that, other teachers in your own curriculum. So what we like to do is to spend that time, like end of May, June, focusing on something, since we're closer to the date. And I'm still brainstorming, as I hear this. So I think that would be great to hear from experts as part of their research for some sort of project around these themes. And again, it's all in my head right now, but that's something that I'd be grateful for the opportunity to do for the students at the end of the year, to do a really meaningful project.
All right. So without further ado, I'm going to have my next speaker come up, Stephen Fox.
for the training is. Just a moment, folks. Hope you're all doing good.